I was driving my truck across the state highway in the middle of the night. It was deserted, but it was not much surprising to me. Since I had traveled through this route on a couple of occasions, I knew that it usually gets lonely at night. Anyway, it does not matter much to me since it is barely a 4-hour-long drive. So I was driving as usual. However, there was one thing a little out of the ordinary. I saw a man ask for a lift. He was a hitchhiker, and I have a strict self-decided policy toward hitchhikers. I never stop for them. And I do feel guilty about it, but I prefer to not put myself at risk. So I saw this man stand at the corner turn, asking for a lift. He didn't say much. I was driving downhill and the road was curvy. I saw him at the first turn and just noticed him. He had his hand out, but I did not see it at first. I continued driving along the curve. Now the road was actually a zigzag downhill. So I knew I could see him again once I drive my truck past it. I kept an eye on him because I had to see him stand on the elevated ground. But he was not there. To my surprise, he was on my level. He had probably jumped a level down and reached the side of my road. His sudden appearance had caught me off guard, and so I was noticing his actions or movements. If he was so quick in jumping or making his way down the elevated ground, he could have easily pounced on my truck and climbed on it. But he didn't. As I moved past him, he just stood there with his hand stretched out. But I didn't stop. I kept driving at the same speed, or maybe slightly faster. I shrugged it off and continued on my path. As my truck made a turn around the corner, I noticed that I was going to cross the same path again, on lower ground. You see, I was still making my way downhill. I kept a close eye on the spot where I last saw him, but he was not there. I quickly looked under the same spot, assuming he again made his way down the slope and waited at the side, but he was not there. In fact, he was not visible anywhere. I relaxed and continued on my path. The idea of the stranger asking for a ride made me uncomfortable, especially considering how he never spoke a word. He just put his hand out and stood like an emotionless statue. I decided to move on since I was almost more than halfway downhill. And it was almost impossible for him to show up now, especially knowing that he was not seen for the last few minutes, despite the road that went through the same hill. I resumed the music and decided to move on. I was on a notoriously accident-prone route, and it was dark. My priority should be to keep an eye on the road, and not for the creepy hitchhiker dude. The road was bumpy, so I drove slowly for the next few minutes. The last thing I wanted at that moment was to not have a punctured tire. So I kept driving as safely and slowly as possible. As I made the turn around the curve, I saw the man again. He was standing on the side of the road. As usual, he had his hand stretched out. Not a single expression over his face. I was paranoid. It was impossible that he had made his way downhill in such a short time, and that too with ease. He was not even panting. I accelerated along the curve and zoomed past him. He did not say a word. I looked back to see what he did after my truck passed. I wanted to know if he immediately rushes downhill. But to my surprise, he was not there. He was missing. I gasped, realizing that the road was empty, as if he never stood there asking for the ride. I faced ahead to see the road, and I saw him stand right ahead of my truck. And before I could apply my brakes, my truck dashed into him, and he landed with a loud thump on the floor behind. I was scared to the core, but I did not stop. I decided to keep driving, and I did. For the next few miles, I pressed the gas and went on at the maximum possible speed that I could go on over the terrain. Later, I saw a patrolling car. I parked beside him and approached the patrolling officer. After narrating the entire incident to him, he plainly looked at me and asked me to ignore it. I was stunned. I mean, I had just crashed and hit a man on the road, and he did not care about it. He later explained that I was not the only one. Many drivers had experienced the same thing. The main positive thing that I did was that I did not stop to give him a ride. He claimed that the entity I encountered was not a human. It was a trickster. A trickster who has tricked and led many unwary travelers crashing downhill. The road was not much dangerous, but the trickster was indeed. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I was on a road trip with my buddies. My dad's truck was available, and so we hopped onto it for an adventure. It was summertime, and we had planned to hit the road. Now I am not a fan of night drives, but the idea of driving on the highway, and that too in the middle of the night, is a little exciting. Yes, I was well aware of the risks. Apart from the fact that it is always dangerous to drive at night, there is always an additional risk of criminals or animals lurking around. The highway that we were on was not much busy that night. So we were driving casually, and partying too. We were drinking and screaming while driving. But again, the highway was empty and we were not disturbing anybody. Amidst the loud music, suddenly we heard a loud thumping sound. And the noise from the truck's engine stopped out of nowhere. We drove to the side as the engine slowly came to a still. Out of all possibilities that could go wrong, the truck had decided to break down. That too in the middle of a highway. The 5 of us got off the truck and waited for the call to connect. But the network was so poor that none of us was getting any reception on our devices. 2 of my friends tried to figure out the issue, but to no avail. And that is when the real trouble began. A car approached us and slowed down. We told him about the problem, and he offered help. He said he wouldn't risk getting off his car. So we trusted him. No sane man would stop his car in the middle of the highway for anyone else. He offered a ride to the nearest gas station. We could find some help there. So one of my friends got inside the car and he drove off. We had our doubts, but we waited for him to return. About 15 minutes later, we got restless because there were no signs of him. I opined that the 4 of us could walk in the direction of the gas station. But we couldn't leave my dad's vehicle alone. He was supposed to drive it to work a day later. I know it sounds dumb, but we decided to split up. 2 of us stayed back, while the other 2 walked toward the station. As we stayed back, I sensed that we had taken a risky decision. But now it was too late. We were alone in the middle of a highway. There was a forest on one side and barren land on the other. After waiting for over another 15 minutes, we started to panic. I could also hear an occasional sound coming from the woods. It was the sound of some movement along with the trees. My friend Phil panicked too. We knew that if it was a creature in the woods, we could not even outrun it. So we rushed inside the truck and locked the doors. The lights were already out. So we kept looking for anything moving nearby. As we saw a bobcat make its way, we froze in our spots. Its green eyes could scare off anyone. We were in the truck, so we were not in that big of a danger. But if the bobcat spots us, then we might get in trouble. We were already panting with less air inside the powerless vehicle. The bobcat loitered on the highway and kept looking around. I slipped a little low so that only my eyes and forehead could be visible to the bobcat. Phil had not moved for the last 5 minutes. He kept updating me about its position despite knowing that I was watching it. His brain had shut down. He screamed and panicked as his eyes met the bobcat's eyes. It changed its demeanor. It started walking toward us, and we did not know what to do. We stayed put inside. We knew it would be difficult for it to break the glass. As it pushed its face into the window, Phil slammed the glass. The curious bobcat was now irritated and infuriated. It had taken it as a challenge. The bobcat kept scratching the glass, but to no avail. We let out a sigh of relief and even joked about it. Phil went a step further and teased it from inside. Suddenly, the bobcat leaped above us and stood on the roof. We could sense a dent forming on the top. The roof of this semi-old truck was not strong enough to sustain its weight. We were really scared. We did not know what to do. We decided to stay calm. Phil tried to bang the roof from the inside to scare off the bobcat. But it didn't budge. It stayed up. In fact, it peeped above the window from the opposite side. It knew that we were trapped inside. Phil panicked as the bobcat gave a strong blow to the window. We thought it broke, but it didn't. But yes, there was a crack. A big crack. This only meant one thing. The window could sustain one, or at most two such blows. Then it would break. The bobcat attacked again and some parts of the glass chipped off. Phil panicked and dashed outside on the highway. The bobcat took a moment to understand what was happening. It leaped toward philosophy. I opened my door and threw a can at it. I knew it made no sense, but I was trying to buy Phil some time. There was no way that he was going to outrun a wild animal in a chase. The bobcat hissed at me but turned and moved toward philosophy. He kept running and closed his eyes as a bright light zoomed towards him. The bobcat too stopped in its track and escaped into the woods. It took a moment to see that the headlights were of a car that our friends were returning from. They were back after almost an hour. And had they not reached on time, Phil would have not survived at all. And on a side note, I am never going to drive at night across a highway. And if I ever have to, I am never going to let us split up. If I remember correctly, I was somewhere in Missouri when this happened. I had driven my truck for 6 or 7 hours at a stretch, and I needed a short break. So I stopped at an off-ramp to stretch out and take a breather. As I pulled out and started smoking a cigarette, a little girl from some direction I couldn't figure out giggled loudly and said,
"Hi, sir."
I was stunned by her sudden sound and appearance. My initial reaction was, what the hell is a little kid doing out here at this time? This was mainly because it was about to get dark soon, and there were no houses visible nearby. I looked around to spot any cars parked, but there were none. So I tried to figure that out first. I talked back to her and said hi. She then responded to my hi with,
"My mom says that you will be okay, so you don't have to worry."
Now I was utterly confused and puzzled by what the little girl had just said. I asked her what she meant by what she just said, but I got no response from her. She just stood there, looking at me and not moving a lip. Then all of a sudden, I feel like somebody was standing next to me, but it did not feel negative or bad at all. It just felt like somebody was present right there, standing next to me. I could sense what was going on, but I did not panic. Plus, being a trucker, I had been in such situations before. Since it didn't have a negative vibe to it, I just finished my cigarette at my regular pace, and then got into my truck and left the place. Later, when I was down the road, I realized that I had forgotten to fuel up at my last stop when the warning light came on. So I scrambled to look at my GPS and searched for the nearest truck stop. I found one and set the course. As I rolled up to the truck stop, my truck started sputtering, and I barely made it to the fuel line before the truck started to die. I ran out of fuel right as I got on the fuel line. It wasn't until I was fueling up that it occurred to me what the hell happened at my last stop. A chill ran down my spine as I realized. It was probably the spirit of the mother that told the little kid, who was a spirit too I suppose, that my fuel tank was about to be empty. But that I would be okay. Okay enough to make it to the next gas station. And she was right. It is experiences like these that actually make you rethink the possibilities of this world. I mean, I have seen creatures and things in the sky. Those stories can be made up by anyone. But this, it hits differently. Thank you, little kid and her mother. I hope you two rest in peace. As a seasoned trucker, I've seen truck drivers duke it out so many times while waiting for their turn in the fuel line. I have also seen brawls happen in the back of truck stops. Not only that, but I have also seen many rookies hitting other trucks by accident. I mean, you name it, and I've seen it all. The most memorable fight that I had ever seen was when I was on a trip with a co-driver whom we shall say, our partnership fell apart really fast on the way home. In Arizona, I stop at a truck stop between Flagstaff and the California state line. After an eternity, I finally decided to pull up on the fuel line. I fuel up and go inside to take a shit and get something to drink and snack on. I come back and the sleeper curtain is open, no co-driver. 30 to 45 minutes go by and he comes out. That's cool, take your time because I ain't stopping from here on out. Get it all out now. I put some trash in a couple of bags and put it on the floor. It was mostly his trash from his shift prior that I couldn't stand having in the cabin anymore. He opens the door and dumps the bags on the ground. So I lit his butt up with all the fury that I could muster up. 2 garbage cans 20 feet away. Holy shit, no. I go put the bags in the trash cans and come back to the truck. As I'm doing my logbook, I look up and glance at my mirror. I see 2 drivers flapping wings at each other getting into a fist fight. Oh good, a fight, let's watch. Sorry, but I enjoy watching some action drama. Suddenly they go at it like baboons. Fists flying, but they're not landing any hits. Then one of the drivers picks up the trash cans and throws it at the other driver that can hit him square in the face and blows open with paper towels going all over the place. WWE just rolled into town apparently. So I got out and started walking back to watch, and apparently, every other driver on the fuel line had the same idea. The driver who got trash canned reached into the storage compartment in his truck and pulls out a huge chain with a big-ass padlock on it. He swung it furiously as he was coming back to the front of the truck where the trash canner is. Mr. Chain Gang takes out the pump, takes out his driver's side window, knocks the mirror off his truck, puts a huge gouge in his fender, and then makes it to the trash canner. The guy runs around the other side of the fuel pump, grabs the squeegee, and starts beating Chain Gang with it. All it does is get the guy wet and piss him off more. So now it's a battle of melee weapons. Enough time rolls by that they realize neither weapon of choice is doing any good, so in an epic sequence of moves, they bear hug the living fuck out of each other and flop to the ground and start bicycling each other. I walk inside and tell the lady that there's a fight on the fuel line, and she bolts out the door and breaks them up, like a chaperone breaking up 2 kids fighting on the playground. All this because supposedly Chain Gang said some shit to Trash Canner's wife. His argument was that he didn't do shit, she just walked up and started picking a fight. I believe the chain gunner more than the trash can guy. But why do I care? I had seen some Netflix level drama before my shift. When it comes to my scariest truck driving memory, I'm always reminded of the last time I was driving to New Mexico. That day, I was coming from Colorado to New Mexico. It was a long day, and after driving for over 4 long hours, I generally take a short break to loosen up. I parked on the side, took a piss, and stretched all my muscles. I had specifically stopped at an off-ramp, mainly to shut down for some sleep. At first, I had some trouble falling asleep. It had to do with the risks that I was putting myself into. I had heard so many accounts of my fellow drivers where they had stopped at such random spots and then woken up to being attacked by some animal or burglars or some creepy unexplainable phenomenon. But I really needed some rest. And a quick short one, to be honest. I was not planning on sleeping for hours. All I needed was a power nap. So I set alarm for 15 minutes and dozed off. Before sleeping, I did make sure that the windows were closed and the doors were locked tight. Maybe it was the fatigue, but I slipped into sleep in a jiffy. Not sure how long had passed, but when I opened my eyes, it was getting a little dark. More importantly, I woke up to a car pulling up behind me and turning off its lights. I started getting this really eerie feeling that I needed to get the hell out of Dodge. I decided to not make any panic-stricken movements. I did not want to alarm them at all. So I stayed put in my position. I kept a close eye on the movements of the car behind me. Not the car, of course, but the driver inside. But for some reason or the other, I could not see anyone around. The windshield was a darker tint, so I couldn't see if anyone was inside. But never mind. I did not care as long as no one moved out with a weapon or something. After a couple of minutes, I leaped into the driver's seat, started the truck, and started hauling it onto the highway. As I was taking off, I looked into the driver's side mirror and saw that somebody was standing by the side of the trailer. It was in the blind spot, so I couldn't spot him before. My chicken lights were the only way I was able to see him. I chugged on down to the rest area about 15 miles down the road, and I decided that I will never stop on random points again. My story was nothing as compared to what others have been through. And maybe if I would have not woken up in time, the man would have attacked me or stolen something from the trailer. Just never stop. I'm a truck driver and I work the night shift. I like the quiet and the solitude of the night and the long stretches of empty road. It's peaceful and it pays well. But tonight was different. As I was driving down the highway, I saw something move in the darkness. It was too big to be an animal and too fast to be a person. It was like a blur, a streak of movement that crossed the road in front of me and disappeared into the shadows. I slowed down, trying to see if I could catch another glimpse of whatever it was. But there was nothing. The darkness swallowed it up, and all I could see was the faint glow of my headlights on the asphalt. That's when I heard the sound. A low, growling noise that made my blood run cold. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was close. Too close. I hit the gas and tried to speed away, but it was too late. Something slammed into the side of my truck, sending it careening off the road and into the ditch. I was dazed and disoriented, my head spinning from the impact. But I knew I had to get out of there. I fumbled with the door handle and stumbled out into the night. That's when I saw it. The creature that had attacked me. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It had the body of a bear, but the head of a wolf. Its eyes were glowing red in the darkness, and its teeth were bared in a snarl. I was frozen, unable to move as it approached me. But then, just as it was about to pounce, it suddenly turned and ran off into the woods. I was grateful to be alive, but I was also terrified. I had never seen anything like that before, and I knew that I was lucky to have survived. I got back in my truck and started driving again, hoping to put as much distance between me and that creature as possible. But as I drove, I realized that something was wrong. The air was thick with a sense of unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I saw it. In the distance, there was a flickering light. It was coming from an old, abandoned house on the side of the road. I should have kept driving, but something drew me to it. I felt like I had to see what was there, and if it was safe, I could request them to let me stay the night. I pulled over and got out of my truck, walking towards the house. As I got closer, I could see that it was falling apart. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging off its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty and stale, and the only light came from the flickering candle on the floor. I couldn't see anything else, but I could feel the presence of something else in the room. That's when I heard the laughter. It was high-pitched and manic, and it made my skin crawl. I turned towards the sound, but there was nothing there. And then I heard it again, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I knew I had to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. I was already regretting my decision to visit this house. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure, lurking in the corner of the room. It was like a person, but twisted and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. It started moving towards me, slowly at first, but then took pace. I was so scared and terrified that I turned and ran with all my life and got into my truck. As I continued driving, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. I had this unnerving sensation that I was being watched, and it sent chills down my spine. I tried to shake it off and turn my attention to the road, but my mind kept drifting back to that eerie feeling. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated something in the distance. At first, I couldn't make out what it was, but as I got closer, I realized it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, and my truck screeched to a halt just a few feet away from the figure. As I peered through the windshield, I saw that it was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked like she had been in a terrible accident. I rolled down my window and asked if she needed help, but she just stood there, staring at me with vacant eyes. I was about to get out of the truck when suddenly, she let out a blood-curdling scream that seemed to echo throughout the entire valley. I recoiled in terror and slammed my foot on the gas pedal, speeding away from the woman as fast as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to calm myself down. I knew I had to keep my wits about me if I wanted to make it home alive. But just as I thought I was in the clear, something else caught my eye. In the distance, I saw a large, dark figure moving towards me. As it got closer, I realized that it was the same animal creature I had seen a few minutes ago. It lunged at my truck, and I could feel the impact as it hit the side of my vehicle. I swerved to avoid it, but it continued to pursue me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I tried to speed away, but the creature was too fast, and I could feel its hot breath on my neck. In a moment of sheer desperation, I hit the brakes and slammed the door open, ready to make a run for it. But as I stepped out of the truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing before me was a group of people, all dressed in tattered white robes, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They began to chant, and as they did, the creature behind me disappeared into the darkness. I tried to run, but I felt a force pulling me back towards the group. I struggled and fought, but it was no use. They had me in their grasp, and as they closed in, I knew that I was doomed. And that's the last thing I remember before waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. They told me that I had been found on the side of the road, covered in bruises and scratches, with no memory of how I got there. But I knew the truth. I had come face to face with something truly evil, and I had narrowly escaped with my life. From that day on, I never drove that lonely stretch of road again, and I always made sure to keep my eyes peeled for anything that might be lurking in the shadows. I was having a pretty bad day at work. Things weren't going as per plan, and there was a lot of backlog which was to be executed before the deadline. Thankfully, it was a Friday night, and the only motivation I had was the long weekend I had ahead of me. I had been driving for hours. My mind and body were exhausted after a long day on the road. As a truck driver, I'm used to the long hours and endless miles, but tonight was different. I felt something strange in the air, a presence that I couldn't explain. The darkness outside the windows seemed to thicken, the shadows deepening as if alive. The feeling of being watched crept over me, making me check the mirrors and the road ahead nervously. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight. I tried to brush it off, thinking it might be some deer hiding away in the bushes. As I went on driving, my truck started to shudder, the engine protesting as if in pain. I cursed under my breath, not wanting to break down in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't the first time when my truck stopped in the middle of the road. I had faced such instances before. But then this night was different. As the truck slowed down, I saw something in the headlights. A figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it might be some hitchhiker or someone lost. But as I got closer, the figure started to change, becoming more ethereal, more ghostly. I felt my blood run cold as I realized what I was looking at. The ghostly figure was a woman, her face twisted in pain and sadness. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, her long hair tangled and unkempt. I could see right through her, and she was glowing with an eerie light. Maybe she might have lost track and was lost for months. As I pulled over to the side of the road, the woman seemed to walk towards my direction, her eyes fixed on mine. I tried to shake off the fear that was creeping over me, but it was impossible. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The woman stopped next to my truck. She reached out a hand, knocking as calmly as possible as if there was nothing wrong with her. I can't begin to describe how terrifying that knock alone. I shouted at her to back off and go away. But the knock kept getting louder and faster. I gasped, the sound muffled by the terror that was choking me. The woman's voice was barely audible, a whisper in the wind. "Help me," she said, her eyes pleading with me. "Please, help me." I tried to speak, but no words would come out. My throat felt dry and constricted, as if I was being strangled. I felt like I was losing control of my own body, as if the ghostly figure was taking over. My head felt heavy. I tried restarting my truck and paid and cursed for it to start this time. I don't know if I was lucky of what, but the truck jump-started and I turned to look at that woman's direction again. The woman disappeared like she was never there. Her image faded into the darkness. I felt my truck shaking violently, the engine making a strange sound like a scream. I realized that I was no longer alone in my truck, that something else was there with me. The ghostly figure reappeared, her eyes blazing with anger. She reached out a hand and was banging her hands with anger on my truck. I could feel the coldness of her existence. All of a sudden there were bats and crows flying around above me in the sky. It was deafening. I could feel my consciousness slipping away, my body falling under her control. It was only when I thought of my family, waiting for me at home, that I was able to find the strength to fight back. I pressed the accelerator and without wasting any second drove off the road. I felt the grip of fear and terror slipping away. The ghost disappeared into the darkness, her form fading into nothingness. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling like I had just escaped from the jaws of death. As I drove off, I looked back at the spot wondering if it really was a ghost or was it a woman trying to find her way back home. It was so terrifying that even the thought that night leaves me in sweat. If that figure was a woman trying to find her way back, I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. But the very possibility that she might be a shadow of my imagination or a ghost made me lose my mind. After that night, I never drove my truck alone. I always asked for someone to tag along and assist me. It was another long night of driving ahead of me. As a truck driver, I was used to the quiet of the open road, but something about tonight just didn't feel right. I was on my way to work, and my shift didn't start for a few more hours, but I liked to get an early start on my deliveries. It gave me time to take breaks and keep a steady pace throughout the night. As I was driving, I noticed a strange sensation in the air. It was as if there was some kind of presence in the truck with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, my truck began to sputter and shake. I knew that this wasn't just my imagination, my truck was in trouble. I cursed the maintenance guy under my breath and pulled over to the side of the road and tried to assess the damage. I knew that I was going to be late for work if I didn't fix it soon, but I also didn't want to risk driving any further with the truck in its current condition. As I was trying to fix the truck, I heard a strange noise coming from the nearby woods. It was almost like a faint whisper, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I tried to ignore it, focusing on fixing the truck, but the whispering only grew louder. I thought maybe some deer or kangaroo might be hovering around. I decided to take a detour to try and find somewhere safe to park and fix the truck. As I drove down a winding road, the whispering got louder and louder until it was almost deafening. I started to feel like I was being pulled into some kind of loop, driving down the same road over and over again. I was familiar with the route, but for some reason, I had never been on that road ever. Panic set in as I realized that I was lost in this strange loop, unable to escape. The whispering turned into a full-blown chorus of voices, each one chanting in unison. It felt like a crazy group of witches were having their time of their night somewhere around. I felt like I was going insane, trapped in this endless cycle. As I tried to break the cycle, the truck's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was an apparition, a ghostly figure that seemed to be beckoning me closer. I felt a sense of dread wash over me, but I couldn't turn away. Maybe it really are just witches, I told myself, thinking that they aren't harmful. I stepped out of the truck, trying to get a better look at the figure. As I approached, the figure reached out and touched me. She had a long cloak around her body with hair down. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized that I had gotten myself into something strange and out of the world. I tried to run back to the truck. The voices continued to chant, the ghostly figure continued to beckon me, and I knew that I was doomed to something unspeakable. I climbed into my truck and kept finding my way out. I was worried about running out of gas or running into some wild wolf in that jungle. It was so terrifying that I almost believed that was the last day of my life. I started to cry thinking of my family back home when I heard a honking sound nearby. The road was on the other side of the road, and I decided to run my truck through it, ignoring all the possibilities of damage and accidents. To my luck, I got on the other side and drove right back home. I called in sick that day. I cannot explain what that person was or who she was. I can't explain the voices I heard and the chants they sang. I still am unsure if I really was in a loop or was some external force playing around me with me. Every time I think about that night, I lose my mind, unable to do anything else. I had been driving my truck on this deserted road for hours, and I was exhausted. The only light was coming from my headlights, and the sound of my truck's engine was the only thing that kept me company. I had been on the road so long that I couldn't even remember the last time I saw another car. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I saw something in front of my truck. It was too dark to make out what it was, but it looked like a figure standing right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, and my truck screeched to a halt. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I thought maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as I looked ahead, I could still see the figure standing there, motionless. I reached for my flashlight thinking that maybe somebody might be in need of help and got out of the truck. The air was cold and eerie outside, and my breath was visible in the darkness. As I approached the figure, it became clearer. It was a man, standing completely still, staring right at me. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, like something out of a different era. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need some help?" I asked, hoping to get a response from him. But he just stood there, staring blankly into space. I took a few steps closer, but he didn't budge. I asked again, "Hey, hope everything is good, mate?" But was again met with no response. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if the world around me had stopped. I couldn't hear the sound of the wind, or even the sound of my own breath. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then, as if nothing had happened, everything came back to life. The wind was blowing, and the sound of crickets filled the air. The man was gone. I looked around, but there was no sign of him. I got back into my truck and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again and again, but nothing happened. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no phone signal and no way to call for help. As I sat there in my truck, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Then, I heard a sound coming from outside the truck. It was like someone was tapping on the window. I slowly turned my head to see what it was, and my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from before, standing right outside my window, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I tried to start the engine again, but it was no use. The man just stood there, tapping on the window, and I was frozen in terror. What was going on? I had never felt so terrified. Suddenly, he started to fade away, disappearing into the darkness. I wasn't able to make sense of anything that was happening. After what felt like hours, my truck finally started, and I sped away from that place as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, where I finally got out of the truck and took a deep breath. I'll never forget that night, and I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by that eerie figure on the road. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened. All I know is that it was the scariest experience of my life, and I never want to go through something like that again. I had been driving alone for hours, trying to reach my destination before sunrise. It was late at night, and I was exhausted. My eyelids felt heavy, and I could feel myself drifting off. I rubbed my eyes, trying to stay awake, and that's when I saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, directly in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I hit her with a sickening thud. Shaken, I stepped out of the car, fearing the worst. but there was no one there. I was pretty sure that somebody was there. The road was empty. I looked back at my truck and it was acting abnormally. The headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. I cursed under my breath and opened the hood. As I worked on the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up and there she was again. The woman in the white dress stood just a few feet away from me. Her face was twisted in a grotesque sneer, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. I was terrified, but I tried to keep my cool. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. But she didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes never leaving my face. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you want?" I asked again, but she didn't reply. Instead, she just vanished into thin air. I was left standing there alone, with nothing but the sound of crickets and my own heavy breathing. I got back into my car, my heart racing. As I started the engine, the car began to shake violently. The radio turned on by itself, and I heard a low, whispering voice that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The voice grew louder and more insistent, and I could make out the words now. "Please leave my child with me," it whispered. "I beg you to stay away." I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal and sped away as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I was miles away, and even then, I half expected to see her standing in the middle of the road again. When I shared this experience with my family, no one seemed to believe me. But from that day on, I never drove alone at night again. I always made sure to have a passenger, no matter how inconvenient it was. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was never really alone. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving my truck through the remote countryside, miles away from city light. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I was feeling tired and restless, and all I wanted was to make it to my destination and get some rest. But fate had something else in store for me. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud and felt my truck shake violently. At first, I thought it was just a pothole, but when I looked out of my window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A massive animal was attacking my truck, clawing at the metal and snarling viciously. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, with razor-sharp teeth and eyes that glowed like fire. I knew I had to act fast, or I would be its next meal. I slammed on the gas pedal and tried to drive away, but the creature was too fast for me. It kept pace with my truck, swiping at the windows and howling like a demon. I could feel its hot breath on my neck, and the stench of rotting flesh filled my nostrils. I was in a panic, trying to steer my truck and fight off the creature at the same time. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I fumbled for my gun. I fired several shots at the beast, but it only seemed to make it angrier. It let out a deafening roar and lunged at me with its claws. I managed to dodge its attack, but the truck swerved off the road and crashed into a ditch. I was dazed and disoriented, but I knew I had to keep fighting. I crawled out of the truck, still clutching my gun, and faced the creature head-on. We circled each other, both of us panting heavily. The rain was still pouring down, making the ground slick and treacherous. I could see my breath in the cold air, and I knew I was in for the fight of my life. The creature charged at me again, and I fired my gun. This time, the bullet hit its mark, and the beast let out a final, ear-splitting scream. It fell to the ground, its body twitching and convulsing. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the lifeless body of the creature. I was covered in mud and blood, my heart racing with adrenaline. I knew I had survived a brush with death, but I also knew that I would never forget this night. As I drove away from the scene, I couldn't help but wonder what other monsters might be lurking in the darkness, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting travelers like myself. The road ahead seemed endless. My mind was racing with questions. What kind of creature was that? How did it get there? Was it the only one, or were there more? The storm was still raging, and the wind was howling like a pack of wolves. My truck was battered and bruised, and I was lucky it was still running. I drove for hours, hoping to find some sign of civilization, but there was nothing in sight. Eventually, I saw a faint light in the distance, and my heart leaped with hope. It looked like a gas station, and I knew I had to stop there and call for help. I pulled into the parking lot, and my headlights illuminated a scene that made my blood run cold. The gas station was in shambles, with broken windows and torn-up pavement. The doors were hanging off their hinges, and there was no sign of life. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, and yet the light was still on inside. I cautiously approached the building, my gun at the ready. As I pushed open the door, I was greeted with a sight that made me wish I had never come. Inside, there were dozens of mutilated bodies, torn apart by something that could only be described as a monster. The walls were splattered with blood, and the air was thick with the stench of death. I could see claw marks on the floor, and I knew that whatever did this was still out there. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. But as I turned to leave, I heard a noise that made my heart stop. It was the sound of something breathing, something big and angry. I spun around, my gun at the ready, and saw the creature that I thought I had killed. It was alive and well, and it was standing right in front of me. I fired my gun, but it didn't even flinch. It just stood there, its eyes fixed on me. I knew I was outmatched, but I refused to go down without a fight. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with fur as black as midnight. Its eyes glowed with a sinister light, and its claws were longer than my fingers. It charged at me, and I dodged to the side. I fired my gun again, but it had no effect. I could feel its hot breath on my face, and I knew that this was the end. Just as I was about to be torn apart, I heard a sound that made me feel hope. It was the sound of sirens, and I knew that help was finally on the way. The creature turned to face the noise, and I took my chance. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back until I was sure I was safe. When I finally turned around, the creature was gone. The sirens were getting closer, and I knew that I had survived another brush with death. As I sat in the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket and covered in bandages, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors were out there, waiting for their next victim. The world was a dark and dangerous place, and I knew that I would never be the same again. I had been driving for hours, and the only thing keeping me company was the monotonous hum of my truck's engine. It was late at night, and I was on a deserted stretch of highway, with nothing but the occasional street light to break up the darkness. Suddenly, my truck came to a stop. I quickly checked my gauges, but everything seemed to be in order. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I stepped out of the cab to check the engine, but before I could even open the hood, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I turned around to see a group of men, their faces obscured by black balaclavas. I instinctively reached for my tire iron, but before I could make a move, one of them pulled out a gun and pointed it at my head. The man in a gruff voice said,
"Hand over your wallet and keys."
I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But as I reached for my wallet, a rustling sound in the nearby bushes caught my attention. Suddenly, a large, wild animal lunged out of the bushes and attacked the robbers. I didn't get a good look at it, but it was unlike any animal I had ever seen before. It was massive, with razor-sharp teeth and claws, and it moved with a terrifying speed. The robbers were taken by surprise, and before they could react, the animal had already torn through their ranks. I heard the sound of gunshots, but they only seemed to anger the creature further. In a matter of moments, the robbers had scattered, their screams echoing across the deserted highway. I was left alone with the creature, which now turned its attention to me. I could see its eyes glinting in the darkness, and I knew that I was in serious danger. I backed away slowly, hoping to get back into the truck, but the creature was too quick. It lunged at me, and I fell to the ground, my tire irons slipping out of my grasp. I braced myself for the worst, but the creature didn't seem interested in attacking me. Instead, it sniffed around me for a few moments, as if trying to decide whether or not I posed a threat. And then, without warning, it bounded away into the darkness, leaving me alone and shaking on the side of the highway. I eventually managed to get the truck. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I turned on the engine, and the truck roared back to life. I carefully checked my surroundings before continuing down the highway, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of the robbers or the creature. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As I drove, my mind started to race. What was that thing? Was it a wild animal or something else entirely? The questions kept piling up in my mind, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still out there. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise coming from the back of the truck. It sounded like something was scratching at the metal doors. My heart started to race again as I slowed the truck down, trying to see what was going on. But it was pitch black outside, and I couldn't see a thing. All hell broke loose when my engine died, and I was stuck there in the pitch dark. I literally had no other choice but to climb down and check what was wrong. I pulled over to the side of the road and cautiously climbed out of the truck, my hand resting on my gun. As I walked around to the back of the truck, the scratching noise grew louder and more frantic. My heart pounding in my chest, I lifted the latch and slowly opened the door. And that's when I saw it. The creature that had attacked the robbers was now inside my truck. It was a massive creature with fur as black as night and eyes that glowed like fire. Its long claws dug into the metal floor, leaving deep scratches in its wake. Its teeth were razor sharp, and drool dripped from its jaws. I stood frozen in fear, not knowing what to do. The creature lunged at me, and I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. I fell hard on the ground, my gun flying out of my hand. The creature was on top of me in an instant, its hot breath on my face. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst, but nothing happened. When I opened my eyes again, the creature was gone. I sat up slowly, rubbing my head where I had hit it on the ground. But the creature was nowhere to be seen. I climbed back into the truck thinking I would rather spend my night in the truck than step out. I decided to turn the key in case my engine comes to life. Thankfully, it did. My hands were shaking. I drove the rest of the way in a daze, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. When I finally reached my destination, I parked the truck and sat there for a while, trying to collect myself. As I sat there, I couldn't help but think about the creature. Was it still out there, waiting for its next victim? Or was it just a figment of my imagination, brought on by the stress of the night's events? What was that creature? Where did it come from? And most importantly, would it come back? I may never know the answer, but one thing is for sure, I will never forget the night a group of robbers and a wild creature tried to take me down on a deserted highway. Every time I drive down that stretch of highway, I can't help but feel a sense of unease. There are things out there in the darkness, things that we can't explain or understand. And sometimes, they come for us when we least expect it. It was my first day on the job as a truck driver, and I had been driving for hours. I was tired, but I had to make this delivery on time. I was driving through a deserted road in the middle of nowhere, and the only sound I could hear was the engine of my truck. The moon was full, but it was covered by clouds, making it impossible to see anything on the road. I was relying on the headlights to guide me. Suddenly, something ran across the road. It was too fast for me to see what it was, but it was big, really big. I hit the brakes and came to a stop. I was scared, but I thought it was just an animal and that it had run away. I continued driving, trying to forget what had just happened. After a few minutes of driving, I saw something moving in the bushes on the side of the road. It was too dark to see what it was, but it looked like an animal. I kept driving, trying to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was following me, keeping pace with the truck. It was like it was stalking me. Suddenly, the creature jumped out of the bushes and onto the road. It was massive, at least the size of a bear, but it wasn't a bear. It was something else entirely. It had dark, matted fur, and its eyes glowed red in the darkness. It had razor-sharp teeth, and its breath was hot and foul. I tried to speed up, but the creature was faster. It jumped onto the truck, and I could feel its weight shaking the entire vehicle. I was terrified. I had never seen anything like it. I tried to swerve the truck, but it was too heavy. The creature started to claw at the windows, trying to get inside. I could hear its breath and the sound of its claws scraping against the metal. I thought it was going to break through any second. I was running out of options. I had to do something, anything, to get away from this thing. I reached for my flashlight and shone it at the creature. It recoiled, and I took the opportunity to hit the gas. I drove as fast as I could, the creature still clinging onto the side of the truck. It was like it didn't feel pain, like it was invincible. After what felt like hours, the creature finally let go. It disappeared into the darkness, and I didn't see it again. I drove for another hour until I reached a gas station. I stopped there to catch my breath and to try and make sense of what had just happened. I never did find out what that creature was. I tried to describe it to people, but no one believed me. They thought I was crazy or that I had imagined it. But I knew what I saw. I knew that it was real and that it was out there somewhere, waiting for its next victim. From that day on, I never drove at night again. I couldn't bear the thought of encountering that creature again. And even now, years later, I still have nightmares about it. I know that it's out there, watching, waiting. And I know that one day, it will find me again. I've been a truck driver for years, and I've seen some pretty wild things on the road. But nothing compares to what happened last night. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, with rain pouring down so heavily I could barely see the road ahead of me. Suddenly, my truck just stopped. All the lights on the dashboard went out, the engine died, and I was stuck there, in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain. I tried everything I could think of to get the truck started again, but it was no use. I was stuck there, alone, with nothing but the sound of the rain and the occasional distant thunder to keep me company. And then I heard it. A low growl, coming from somewhere out there in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and shone it out into the darkness. And that's when I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, staring back at me from the darkness. And then, before I knew it, the creature leaped at me. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen with fear, watching as the creature barreled towards me. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was like a cross between a wolf and a bear, with razor-sharp teeth and claws that looked like they could tear me to shreds in an instant. Just as the creature was about to pounce, I remembered the can of pepper spray I kept in my truck. I quickly reached for it and sprayed the creature in the face. It let out a guttural howl of pain and recoiled, giving me just enough time to scramble back into my truck. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but the creature wasn't done yet. It started to ram into the side of my truck, over and over again, like it was trying to break through. I was terrified, unsure of how long the truck could withstand the creature's relentless attacks. After what felt like hours, but was probably just a few minutes, the creature finally gave up and disappeared into the night. I sat there in my truck, heart pounding, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. It was as if the battery had died. I checked the lights and they were still on, but the windshield wipers had stopped working. As I sat there in the dark and rain, I heard something rustling outside. I rolled down the window just a bit, trying to see what was going on. That's when I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, watching me from the darkness. I couldn't make out what kind of animal it was, but it looked big and dangerous. I started to panic, wondering if I was going to become its next meal. Suddenly, there was a loud thud on the roof of the truck. The whole vehicle shook and I heard something scraping against the metal. I screamed, thinking that the animal had somehow climbed on top of the truck and was trying to get in. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. The rain was coming down even harder now, making it almost impossible to see anything outside. I was completely trapped, with no way to defend myself. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard a series of gunshots ringing out in the distance. The animal outside let out a pained howl, and then everything went silent. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, too scared to move. Eventually, I mustered up the courage to get out of the truck and assess the damage. That's when I saw the bloodstains on the roof, along with a set of deep claw marks. I knew that I had narrowly escaped a deadly encounter with a wild animal, but I had no idea who had saved me. All I could do was thank my lucky stars that I was still alive. I eventually managed to get the truck started again and drove as fast as I could away from that place. I didn't stop until I reached the next rest stop, where I called the police and reported what had happened. The police arrived, but they didn't find any trace of the creature. They told me it was probably just a wild animal that had been spooked by the storm, but I knew what I had seen. I'll never forget those glowing eyes, or the feeling of absolute terror as that creature attacked me. From now on, I'll always make sure to keep that can of pepper spray within arm's reach whenever I'm out on the road. You never know what kind of horrors might be lurking in the darkness. It was supposed to be a fun road trip and also a chance to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city and explore the countryside. My friends and I piled into the car early one morning, armed with snacks, drinks, and music, ready for a day of adventure. But what started as a thrilling excursion quickly turned into a nightmare, one that I will never forget. We had been driving for hours, taking turns behind the wheel, when we decided to take a detour down a small, deserted road. It was a narrow, winding path, lined with tall trees, and it seemed to lead deep into the forest. At first, we were excited by the sense of mystery and intrigue, but as we drove further in, we began to feel a sense of unease. The road was getting narrower, and the trees seemed to be closing in around us. We could no longer see the sky, and the only light came from the headlights of our car. We started to feel trapped, as if we were being led deeper and deeper into the forest, never to return. That's when we saw the first signs of something wrong. We passed a broken-down car, abandoned by the side of the road. The windows were smashed, and the doors were left open, as if the occupants had fled in a hurry. We didn't stop to investigate, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened there. As we drove further, we started to notice other strange things. We saw a figure standing in the road ahead, but as we got closer, it vanished into the trees. We heard strange noises coming from the bushes, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We were all starting to feel uneasy, and we were discussing about turning back, but we were so deep into the forest that we couldn't find our way back. We decided to keep going, hoping that we would find a way out soon. But as the minutes ticked by, our hope began to fade. It was getting darker, and we could no longer see the road ahead. We were driving slowly, trying to avoid any obstacles, when we saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a long, white dress, and she was staring at us with blank, lifeless eyes. We all screamed and the driver swerved to avoid hitting her, but as we passed, she vanished into thin air. We were terrified and decided to pull over and take a break. We were all in shock, and none of us could stop shaking. We decided to take a short walk to clear our heads, but as soon as we stepped out of the car, we heard a strange noise coming from the woods. It was a low, rumbling growl, like the sound of a large animal. We immediately ran back to the car and locked the doors, but the growling continued, getting louder and more insistent. We could hear something moving in the bushes, and we knew that whatever it was getting closer. We started the car and drove as fast as we could, but the growling followed us, never letting up. We were all sure that we were going to die, that whatever was following us would catch us and kill us. We could see the headlights of our car reflecting off the trees, and we knew that we were getting closer to the end of the road. But just as we were about to break through the trees and into the open, the growling stopped. We were out of the forest, and we could see the lights of a small town in the distance. We pulled over to the side of the road and sat there, staring at each other, speechless. It was an unbelievable encounter, and not all of us could have imagined the same hallucinations. The rest of the trip was fine, but we ensured that we did not use the same route to get back. Being a truck driver for almost a decade, I believe I could write a whole 300-page long memoir on the stuff that I have encountered. Among the worst ones which I can recollect from my truck driving stories, it has to be this one. Oh yes, I am sharing my trucking experience without stepping into the realm of the supernatural or extraterrestrial. Because hell yes, I have seen some of that too. I think I could share one of those stories too. But before that, let me tell you about this one incident that had nothing to do with anything paranormal. So now to the story. It happened in my initial years of trucking. It was when I was driving across the Bisty Highway to visit my grandpa who lived in a place called Grants. In case you haven't heard the name before, it is close to Gallup. Now since I was not on duty, I was simply just humdrumming my truck happily down the road. The ride was all good, and I was already anticipating all the fun that I was going to have after meeting my grandpa after a long time. I was around an hour's drive away from my destination when I passed 4 identical solid black Dodge Chargers parked on either side of the road. At first, they looked insanely dope, but when I realized that I was the only driver on the road apart from these 4, I felt a little creeped out. What if they were on some top-secret government shadow op, and now they had to assassinate me as I had spotted them? Jokes apart, I thought it was weird to see them there, but I kept driving. I made sure that I don't catch their attention at all. I didn't push the brake at all. Neither did I slow down or anything. In fact, I did not even turn my neck to get a better look. I did ponder upon it for a while, but continued driving no matter what. Now they were parked, so within a minute itself, they were out of my view. They looked pretty dope, and now that I was far from any potential threat, I appreciated the aura they possessed as a crew. 4 solid black Dodge Chargers just parked on the side of a highway. I kept driving and looked in my rear view a few miles later, and guess what I saw? The 4 Dodge Chargers. They were trailing me. Again, it was a beautiful sight, but now that they were right behind me, it looked like I was in some sort of trouble. They kept following me and maintained the same distance at all times. If I sped up, they sped up, and when I slowed down so that they could overtake me, they too slowed down. I started getting a bit freaked out after a point, especially when 2 of them broke off and got in front of me, and the 3rd got on my left side and just sat there. It was a very well choreographed movement by them, but it gave me a clear hint that they had done this before. Once that happened, I was preparing myself. I wasn't going to be pulled over and beaten by a bunch of thugs. I pulled the gun out of the center console for my defense. I was ready. I was waiting for one sketchy movement before I would shoot my shots. But they didn't. The ride continued for a couple of miles. In fact, they keep maintaining the same positions up for a good 5 or 6 miles more. Then, they all got in front of me and hauled gas. Gone in a flash. They had no license plates, no temp tags, and nothing on them. It was just a bunch of random drivers who probably pranked me and went off. I don't believe in phantom cars, but that was the closest to what I had seen. I have this another story to share. It was a dark and stormy night when I set out on my long drive home. I had been working till very late and was eager to get home to my family. I had been on the road for about an hour and the rain was coming down in sheets. The windshield wipers were working overtime, but it was still hard to see the road ahead. As I drove, I noticed that the headlights of oncoming cars seemed to be brighter than usual. I brushed it off as just the glare of the rain and continued driving on my way. But as the night wore on, the headlights seemed to be getting closer and closer. I started to feel uneasy, like someone was following me for a long time. I looked in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the closer the headlights seemed to get, the more anxious I became. Suddenly, the car behind me turned on its high beams, blinding me. I couldn't see a thing and had to pull over to the side of the road. As I sat there, catching my breath and waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness, I heard a knock at my window. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I rolled down the window to find a man standing there, drenched to the bone. He looked like he had been in a terrible accident. He was covered in cuts and bruises, his clothes were torn, and he had a very weird look in his eyes. He said in a ragged voice,
Please, help me. My car broke down and I've been wandering for hours. Can you give me a ride to the nearest town?
I didn't know what to do. The man looked like he needed help, but something about him made me uneasy. But before I could make a decision, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a gun and pointed it towards me. And then he said, waving the gun in my face,
Just give me a ride.
I was terrified. I had no choice but to do as he said. I got back in my car and he got in the passenger seat. As I pulled back onto the road, he instructed me to drive deeper into the night. As we drove, the man told me his story. He had been in a car accident and had been wandering the roads for days, trying to find help. He was delirious and kept ranting about how he had to get away from something that was chasing him. But the more he talked, the more I realized that he was not making any sense. His story was filled with inconsistencies and contradictions. I assumed that he was a lunatic, maybe a psycho killer. And the further we drove, the more certain I became that this man was not a victim of a car accident, but something far more sinister. I knew that I had to get away from him, but I was too afraid to make a move. The storm outside was getting worse, and the road was becoming increasingly treacherous. And then, in the distance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was a pair of headlights, but they were unlike any headlights I had ever seen before. They were red, and they seemed to be getting closer and closer. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I knew deep down that we were being followed by something that was not human. The man beside me seemed to sense it as well. He was gripping the gun tightly and mumbling to himself. We drove on, the red headlights getting closer and closer until I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over to the side of the road, got out of the car, and ran into the darkness. I didn't see the lights anymore. They were gone in a flash. I bent to my window to tell him about the sudden disappearing of the light. But to my surprise, he too was gone. I was shell-shocked, and I did not know what to do. Paranoid, I got back in my car and continued to drive on my way back home. Nothing of that sort happened in the remainder of my journey. But I was not high on alcohol or any sort of drugs, or even medications. I wasn't sleep-deprived to see hallucinations of that level. But there were no traces of a man sitting in my car at all. It just gives me chills whenever I think of that night. I remember being told this story by my granddad. Once upon a time, there was a truck driver friend of his, named Daniel. And he had been driving his truck for over 20 years. He had always been a solitary man and enjoyed the long hours on the road, but there was one route that he avoided at all costs. It was a desolate stretch of highway that ran through a remote, wooded area. The locals called it the Devil's Highway and claimed that it was haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. One night, Daniel was forced to take the Devil's Highway due to a detour. As he drove, he began to feel a sense of unease. The trees seemed to close in on him, and he could hear strange noises coming from the woods. He tried to shake off the feeling and focus on the road, but soon he saw something that chilled him to the bone. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, with wild, unkempt hair. She looked as if she had been standing there for a long time, waiting for him. Daniel slammed on the brakes and swerved to avoid hitting her, but she was gone as quickly as she had appeared. Shaken, Daniel pulled over to the side of the road and tried to calm himself. But as he sat there, he heard a knock on the door of his truck. Slowly, he opened the door to find the woman standing there, her face twisted in a grotesque grin. She reached out and touched his face, and he felt a coldness like death. Daniel screamed and tried to push her away, but she was too strong. She climbed into the cab of the truck and sat beside him, whispering in his ear.
I've been waiting for you, Daniel. I've been waiting for you for so long.
Daniel realized then that this woman was not a woman, but a ghost, one of the many spirits that haunted the Devil's Highway. He was trapped, doomed to drive that road forever, with the ghost of a long-dead woman by his side. From that day on, Daniel's truck was seen driving the Devil's Highway late at night, but no one ever saw Daniel himself behind the wheel. The only thing that could be seen is a figure of a woman sitting in the passenger seat, her ghostly laughter echoing through the trees. The legend of Daniel and the ghost woman still lives on in the small towns along the Devil's Highway, and they say that if you're ever on that road at night, you may be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of the ghost truck, driven by the tormented spirit of Daniel. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The rain was coming down in sheets and the wind was howling, making it almost impossible to see the road. But I was only a few miles from home, and I was determined to make it there safely. The headlights of my car caught through the darkness, illuminating the deserted roads. I was the only one out on a night like this, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time a branch scraped against my window or a gust of wind shook my car, I jumped. As I drove, I began to notice something strange. Every time I passed a side road or a driveway, I could see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the eyes kept appearing, closer and closer each time. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. I knew I was getting close to home, but the eyes seemed to be following me, getting closer and closer. I could hear something moving in the bushes alongside the road, and I knew that whatever was following me was getting closer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw my house in the distance. I let out a sigh of relief and pulled into the driveway, but as I got out of my car, I heard a low growl coming from the bushes. I ran inside and locked the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was following me was still out there, waiting for me. I never found out what was following me that night, but I knew that I would never forget the feeling of being watched, hunted, and followed on that dark and stormy night. I've been a trucker for over a decade now, and I've seen my fair share of strange and terrifying things on the road. But nothing compares to the night I drove down that highway. It was a typical long haul, and I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods from the Midwest to the East Coast. I had just passed through a small town and was making my way onto the highway when I first noticed something was off. It was a dark, moonless night, and the only light on the road came from my headlights. But as I drove, I began to notice something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. I quickly swerved to avoid it, but as I passed, I saw that it was a woman. She was dressed in ragged clothes and had long, wild hair. Her eyes were wide and empty, and she was staring straight at me. I quickly pulled over to the side of the road, my heart racing. I got out of my truck and walked back to where I had seen the woman, but she was gone. I thought maybe I had just imagined it and got back on the road. But as I drove, I kept seeing the same woman over and over again, standing in the middle of the road. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger as I drove. I kept seeing the woman and other strange things too. I saw a man standing by the side of the road, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. I saw a group of children playing in a field, but as I drove closer, I saw that they were rotting, their flesh falling off their bones. I knew I had to be hallucinating. I was tired, I hadn't slept in days, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the things I saw, they were too vivid, too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something dark and malevolent. I finally arrived at my destination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had gripped me on that highway. I never spoke of it to anyone, but that night has stayed with me, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurks on the roads we travel. I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to shake the memory of that night and the things I saw. But I know one thing for certain, I'll never drive down that highway again. I pulled my truck to a stop and checked my map, trying to figure out how I had gotten so turned around. I thought taking a shortcut through this forested area would save me time, but now I was lost on this winding road, surrounded by trees that seemed to tower above me. I looked around for any signs of civilization, but there was nothing but dense forest in every direction. I decided to turn around and retrace my steps back the way I had come, but as I shifted into reverse, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. It was a figure, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, taking a step closer. I froze, my heart racing as I realized that I wasn't alone out here in the woods. I slammed the truck into drive and hit the gas, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever was out there in the darkness. But as I drove, I could feel eyes on me, watching my every move. The road seemed to twist and turn in endless loops, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, like some kind of prey. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but as the night wore on, I began to see movement out of the corner of my eye. It was always just a flicker, a blur of movement in the darkness, but I knew that I was being followed. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped, and the woods around me fell silent. I was about to breathe a sigh of relief when I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing like hot coals in the darkness, just beyond the tree line. They were fixed on me, unblinking, and I knew that whatever was behind them was not of this world. I tried to hit the gas, but the truck wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it in place, rooting me to the spot as the eyes crept closer, step by step. I was paralyzed, unable to move as the creature emerged from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly so, with long limbs that seemed to bend in all the wrong places. Its skin was slick and black, like oil, and its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, and I knew that I was in deep trouble. The creature moved closer, its long fingers reaching out to me as I tried to scramble back. But it was too late. It was like I was caught in a spider's web, its tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me in. I screamed as the creature pulled me towards it, its jaws opening impossibly wide, ready to devour me whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving me alone in the darkness, shaken to my core. I kept driving as fast as I could, but the creature was still following me. It was getting closer, and I could feel its hot breath on my neck. Suddenly, I hit a bump in the road and the truck swerved, nearly tipping over. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw the creature leap up and over the truck, landing on the other side. I knew then that I had to do something drastic if I wanted to survive. I reached for the shotgun that I kept under my seat and loaded it with a silver bullet. I knew that silver was said to be deadly to werewolves, and I was hoping it would work on this creature too. I slammed on the brakes and the truck skidded to a stop. The creature was only a few feet away now, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I aimed the shotgun and fired, hitting it square in the chest. The creature let out a blood-curdling howl and fell to the ground. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, the creature began to stir, its body convulsing and twisting. It looked up at me with hatred in its eyes, and I realized that I had only made it angry. The creature leaped to its feet and charged at me. I fired the shotgun again, but this time it didn't even flinch. I knew then that I was in real trouble. I had to get out of the truck and run. I opened the door and jumped out, running as fast as I could into the forest. The creature was hot on my heels, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground behind me. I could hear its ragged breathing and feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running, but I knew I had to keep going. I couldn't let it catch me. Finally, I burst through a thicket of bushes and found myself in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old cabin. Without thinking, I ran towards the cabin and burst through the door. I slammed it shut and locked it behind me, panting and gasping for breath. I was safe for the moment, but I knew that the creature was still out there, waiting for me. As I looked around the cabin, I saw that it was old and abandoned. There was no electricity or phone line, and the windows were boarded up. I was trapped, with no way to call for help. I knew that I had to come up with a plan, and fast. I searched the cabin for any weapons or tools that I could use to defend myself, but there was nothing. The only thing I could find was an old wooden chair. I waited there in the dark, listening to the creature as it circled the cabin. I could hear its claws scraping against the wood, and its breathing was getting louder and more ragged. I knew that it was only a matter of time before it found a way in. Finally, the creature attacked. It smashed through one of the boarded-up windows and leaped into the cabin, its jaws snapping and its claws slashing. I swung the wooden chair, hitting it in the face and knocking it back. But it was only a momentary reprieve. The creature regained its footing and charged at me again. I swung the chair again, but this time it shattered into pieces. I was defenseless. I knew then that I was going to die. I closed my eyes and braced myself for the creature's attack. But it never came. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. I was left alone in the dark, trembling and scared. I didn't know what had happened to the creature or why it had suddenly disappeared, but I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted, the sense of being nothing more than a piece of prey to something far more powerful than myself. I had been driving my rig for hours, the only sounds around me the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. The road stretched out in front of me, long and empty, with nothing but darkness and shadows to keep me company. That's when I saw him, a figure standing on the side of the road, thumbing for a ride. I normally wouldn't stop for anyone, but I felt a strange compulsion to pick him up. As soon as he got in, I knew something was off. He was pale and thin, his eyes sunken and haunted. But before I could ask him any questions, he spoke. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been waiting for someone like you." I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine and asked him where he was headed. He told me he was going to a small town just up ahead, and that he needed to get there before midnight. We rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the rustle of the wind outside. But as we got closer to the town, the hitchhiker started to act strange. He muttered to himself and shook uncontrollably, his eyes darting around as if he was seeing things that weren't there. I tried to calm him down, but he just kept getting worse. And then, out of nowhere, he lunged at me, his fingers curling into claws. I swerved off the road and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The truck skidded to a halt, and I watched in horror as the hitchhiker vanished into thin air. For a moment, I sat there, stunned and unsure of what had just happened. And then, I heard it, a low, guttural growling that seemed to be coming from all around me. I looked out the windshield and saw that I was surrounded by figures, ghostly and pale like the hitchhiker. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. And then, they started to come closer, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I knew then that I was in serious trouble. As they closed in on the truck, I saw the hitchhiker among them, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage. He was leading the charge, and I knew then that he was seeking revenge on the living. I prayed for a miracle as the ghosts clawed at the windows and doors, their wails filling the night air. But none came, and I knew that my time was up. The last thing I saw before I closed my eyes was the hitchhiker's face, his eyes filled with a hatred that would never die. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, it was still dark. Everything felt normal, like nothing ever happened. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued driving, but the hitchhiker's words kept ringing in my ears. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze on my neck, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to face the hitchhiker, but he had vanished. My heart pounding, I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck. I searched around, but there was no sign of the hitchhiker. I got back in the truck and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering voice coming from outside. It was the hitchhiker, his ghostly figure was walking towards the truck. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. The hitchhiker reached the truck, his face now twisted in a grotesque expression of anger. In a flash, he vanished, and the engine roared back to life. I frantically put the truck in gear and peeled out of there as fast as I could, my heart racing. But as I drove away, I realized that the hitchhiker's ghostly presence was still with me. I could feel his cold breath on the back of my neck and his icy touch on my skin. I knew then that I was not alone, and that I would never be able to escape his wrath. I drove through the night, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, praying that I would make it to my destination. But with every mile that passed, the the hitchhiker's ghostly presence grew stronger, and I knew that I was running out of time. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, I saw a glimmer of hope. A small town was just ahead, and I knew that I could find help there. But as I pulled into town, I realized that I was not alone. The hitchhiker's ghostly figure was still with me, and he was now more powerful than ever. I knew then that I was trapped, and that the hitchhiker's revenge would be complete. He had claimed another victim, and I was his torment for eternity. I had driven through many small towns in my career as a truck driver, but this one was different. There was an eerie feeling in the air, a sense that something wasn't quite right. The people in the town all seemed to be staring at me as I drove through the main street, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made my delivery and tried to leave as quickly as possible, but my truck wouldn't start. I got out to check the engine, and that's when I saw them. A group of people, dressed in robes, were gathering around me. They were chanting in a language I didn't understand, and I could feel their eyes on me. I tried to start the truck again, but it wouldn't budge. The cult members began to close in on me, their eyes filled with an otherworldly glow. I knew then that I was in trouble. One of them approached me and whispered something in my ear. It was a language I had never heard before, but I could sense the malice behind the words. I tried to run, but they caught me and brought me to their temple. The temple was a large building at the edge of town, and it was filled with strange symbols and altars. The cult members tied me up and began to perform a ritual, chanting and dancing around me. I could feel the power of their god growing stronger, and I knew that I was in grave danger. Suddenly, the chanting stopped, and the room grew quiet. A figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the god they worshipped, a creature so ancient and terrible that I couldn't even comprehend its form. It reached out to touch me, and I felt a surge of pain shoot through my body. I screamed as the creature began to drain the life from me, sucking out my essence and leaving me a shell of my former self. I somehow managed to break free and hid behind a giant tree. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should run or stay put. My instincts told me to get out of there as fast as I could, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to stay hidden and watch what was going on. The cult members started chanting in an unknown language, their voices rising in intensity with each passing moment. Suddenly, they all fell silent, and I saw the old man I had spoken to earlier walk up to the altar. He lifted a dagger high in the air and brought it down on the sacrificial lamb's neck, spilling its blood onto the altar. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind couldn't comprehend the fact that I had stumbled upon a cult that practiced human sacrifice. I was frozen in place, unable to move or scream. Suddenly, one of the cult members noticed me hiding in the shadows. He pointed in my direction, and the other members turned to look at me. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stumbled and fell as I tried to get away, but one of the cult members caught up to me and grabbed me by the arm. I struggled to break free, but his grip was too strong. He dragged me back to the altar, where the old man was waiting. "You've seen too much," the old man said, his voice cold and menacing. "You must be sacrificed." I screamed and pleaded for my life, but they didn't listen. They tied me to the altar, and I felt the cold blade of the dagger against my neck. As the old man raised the dagger high in the air, I closed my eyes and prayed for a miracle. Suddenly, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The cult members panicked and scattered in all directions, leaving me behind. The police arrived just in time to save my life. I spent the next few days in the hospital recovering from my injuries. I was traumatized by what I had seen and experienced, and I knew that I would never be the same again. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night. The image of the old man holding the dagger and the sound of the cult members chanting haunt me to this day. I learned the hard way that sometimes, curiosity can lead to the darkest of places, and that some secrets are better left undiscovered. I never drove through that town again, and I never forgot the horror that I experienced. The thought that there are other towns like that, filled with dark secrets and hidden rituals, still haunts me to this day. I drove my rig down the unfamiliar road, the tires crunching on the loose gravel. I had taken this shortcut to save time, but I was starting to regret it. The sky was darkening rapidly, and the trees on either side of the road grew taller and thicker, casting an eerie shadow over everything. I glanced at the GPS on my dashboard, but it was no help. The device had lost its signal miles ago, and I was left with nothing but the faint glow of my headlights to guide me. The road seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning without end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going in circles. I had seen no signs of civilization for hours. No cars, no houses, no people. Just the forest, the road, and my truck. Then, something strange happened. The forest around me began to change. The trees twisted and warped, their branches growing into gnarled, claw-like appendages. The leaves turned black, and the air grew thick with a strange, acrid smell. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing in my chest. What was happening? Was I hallucinating? I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, the forest was still twisted and warped. That's when I heard it, a low growling sound, coming from the darkness beyond the trees. It was followed by a howl, high-pitched and mournful. I put the truck in reverse, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the forest had a hold of me, refusing to let me go. The growling grew louder, and I could see a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness. They were red, like embers burning in the night. I could hear something breathing heavily, the sound of hot, fetid air rushing in and out of its nostrils. I tried to start the truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The growling grew louder, and I could see the shape of the creature now, its outline illuminated by the headlights. It was massive, with fur as black as the night sky and eyes that burned like fire. I was trapped, with no escape. I could hear the creature getting closer, its breathing growing louder and more frantic. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The creature retreated back into the darkness, leaving me alone in the twisted forest. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I shifted the truck into gear and gunned the engine. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and I shot forward, leaving the forest behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, miles away. I never took that shortcut again, and I never spoke of what I had seen to anyone. But the memory of those glowing red eyes, and the sound of that growling, haunted me for years to come. I had been driving my truck through the barren desert for hours. My only company was the radio and the sound of the wheels on the road. I was getting close to my destination, but suddenly my headlights caught something in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a group of people standing in the middle of the road, blocking my way. I tried to swerve around them, but they were too quick for me. Before I knew it, they had climbed onto the back of my trailer and started cutting through the locks. I knew I was in trouble, so I grabbed my shotgun and prepared to defend myself. As soon as the doors of the trailer opened, I was met with a horrifying sight. The bandits were not human, but rather creatures from a nightmare. Their skin was gray and leathery, and their eyes glowed with an otherworldly energy. They were armed with strange, otherworldly weapons that I had never seen before. I fired my shotgun, but it was useless against them. They simply shrugged off my shots and continued their assault. I tried to fight back with whatever I could find in the truck, but it was no use. They were too strong and too fast for me. Before I knew it, I was surrounded by them, trapped and helpless. They seemed to be enjoying themselves, taunting me with their twisted laughter as they closed in for the kill. I could feel their breath on my skin, their razor-sharp claws digging into my flesh. Just when I thought it was over, a bright light filled the sky. The creatures shrieked and recoiled in fear, their forms dissolving into ash as the light consumed them. I could see a shape moving in the distance, silhouetted against the light. As it got closer, I realized it was a spaceship hovering above me. A beam of light shot down from the ship, enveloping me in a warm glow. I felt a sense of peace and safety wash over me as I was lifted off the ground and into the ship. Inside the ship, I was met by a group of beings who looked human, but I could tell they were not from this world. They explained to me that they had been tracking the bandits for some time, and that they had been responsible for countless attacks on innocent people like myself. They thanked me for my bravery in fighting back, but warned me that the creatures would continue to hunt humans until they were stopped for good. I knew I had been lucky to survive, and I promised to do whatever I could to help. As I was released from the ship and returned to my truck, I knew that my life would never be the same. I had seen things that no human should ever have to see, and I had been a witness to a battle between worlds. But I also knew that I had been given a second chance, and that I would use it to fight against the darkness that had nearly consumed me. I was driving my truck down a desolate road in the middle of the night with my 2 other trucker buddies. We were headed to a warehouse in the middle of nowhere to make a delivery. The only sounds we could hear were the hum of our engines and the occasional crackle from the radio. We had been driving for hours, and it felt like we were in a world of our own. As we neared our destination, we stopped at a gas station to fill up our tanks and grab a bite to eat. The gas station was old and run down, with a flickering sign that read "Open 24 hours." We pulled up to the pumps, and I went inside to pay. The inside of the gas station was dark and dingy, with a flickering fluorescent light that gave everything a sickly green tint. I approached the cashier, an old man with sunken eyes and a weathered face. He looked at me with a blank expression and said, "You boys be careful out there. There's things out in these parts that don't take kindly to strangers." I brushed off his warning and paid for our gas and snacks. As I walked back to the truck, I noticed that the other 2 truckers were acting strangely. They were huddled together, whispering and glancing nervously around the gas station. I asked them what was wrong, but they just shook their heads and told me to hurry up. As we pulled out of the gas station and continued down the road, I could feel a sense of unease settling in my gut. The air around us felt heavy and oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and a distorted voice spoke through the static. "You boys best turn back now. This ain't no place for outsiders." We looked at each other in confusion, wondering where the voice was coming from. It seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the darkness like a ghostly whisper. Just then, a figure appeared in the middle of the road ahead of us. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress and with long, tangled hair that obscured her face. She was standing perfectly still, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As we got closer, the woman began to move. She glided towards us with an unearthly grace, her hair whipping around her face like a storm. And then she vanished, disappearing into thin air right before our eyes. We were all stunned into silence, unsure of what we had just witnessed. And then, as if on cue, we heard the sound of footsteps approaching our truck. They were slow and deliberate, as if belonging to someone or something with a purpose. Without warning, the back of our truck opened, and a chill wind swept through the cab. And then we saw them, the ghosts of all the people who had died on this stretch of road over the years. There were men, women, and children, all staring at us with hollow eyes and expressions of terror frozen on their faces. They reached out to us with spectral hands, trying to pull us out of the truck and into the darkness beyond. We tried to drive away, but our truck wouldn't start. We were trapped, surrounded by the ghosts of the dead. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished into the night, leaving us alone and shaken. As we made our way down the dark, deserted road, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a thick fog descended upon us, engulfing the road and making it nearly impossible to see. I slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop just in time to avoid plowing into an abandoned vehicle on the side of the road. As we got out of our trucks to inspect the car, we heard a faint whispering sound coming from the fog. We couldn't make out what it was saying, but the hairs on the back of our necks stood on end. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, and we saw a figure emerging from the fog. It was a woman, her eyes blank and her skin pale as a ghost. She was dressed in a tattered gown, and her hair was wild and unkempt. She approached us slowly, her arms outstretched, and we couldn't move. She spoke to us in a voice that was both ethereal and terrifying, telling us that we were on sacred ground and that we needed to leave immediately. We tried to ask her what she meant, but she simply vanished into thin air, leaving us standing there, dumbfounded. We got back into our trucks and tried to shake off what we had just seen, but the feeling of unease lingered. As we approached the warehouse, we noticed that the entire area was shrouded in the same thick fog we had encountered on the road. We parked our trucks and approached the warehouse on foot, but as we got closer, we realized that something was horribly wrong. The door was ajar, and there was a sickly sweet smell emanating from inside. As we cautiously entered the warehouse, we saw that it was littered with corpses, all of them mangled and torn apart. We tried to run, but the door slammed shut behind us, and we were trapped. We heard the same whispering sound that we had heard on the road, and we knew that we were not alone. We were being watched, stalked by something that was not of this world. We tried to fight back, but it was no use. We were hopelessly outnumbered, and the creature that had been haunting us was too powerful to defeat. In the end, only one of us made it out alive, and he was never the same again. He spoke of a world beyond ours, a place where the dead walked among the living, and where the only thing that mattered was survival. As for the rest of us, we were lost to the fog, consumed by the darkness that had been haunting us all along. We were just another set of victims in a long line of tragedies, forgotten by time and left to rot in the shadows. I had been a truck driver for over 10 years and had driven through every kind of weather condition imaginable, but I had never encountered something as frightening as what I experienced that night. I was driving through a rural part of the country, on my way to deliver a shipment of goods to a small town in the middle of nowhere. The sun had long set and I was navigating through the darkness with only the headlights of my truck to guide me. As I approached a particularly dark stretch of road, my headlights suddenly flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing, and reached for my flashlight. As I turned it on, I saw a figure standing in front of my truck, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I froze, unable to move or even breathe, as the figure slowly began to move towards me. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress and with long, unkempt hair that obscured her face. Her movements were slow and jerky, as if she were struggling to walk. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong about this woman. As she approached my truck, I could see that her eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion or life. I tried to start my truck, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of this horrifying apparition. The woman drew closer and closer until she was standing right outside my window. I could see now that her dress was stained with blood, and that her hands were twisted and gnarled, like the branches of a dead tree. Suddenly, she reached through the window and grabbed me by the throat. Her grip was cold as ice and I could feel my windpipe being crushed by her fingers. I struggled to break free, but it was no use. The woman was too strong, too determined to harm me. As I felt myself slipping away, I heard a faint whisper in my ear. It was the voice of the woman, soft and barely audible, but filled with an otherworldly power. "I've been waiting for you," she said. "You were always meant to be mine." With those final words, I felt my consciousness slipping away, and everything went dark. When I finally awoke, I was alone on the side of the road, with no sign of the woman. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me, but it lingered, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked in the darkness. I was panicking now. The road was empty, and the ghostly figure was nowhere to be seen. I started to calm myself down, convincing myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But just then, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, and I could feel a chill down my spine. I knew that the ghost was still around. I took a deep breath and decided to move on. I started the truck and tried to drive away as fast as possible. But as soon as I hit the gas, the truck stalled. I tried to start it again, but it just wouldn't budge. I was stuck, and I knew that I had no choice but to face the ghost. I stepped out of the truck and looked around. There was no sign of the ghost, but I could feel its presence all around me. I started to walk towards the back of the truck, and that's when I saw it. The ghost was standing there, right in front of me. It was a young girl, with long, dark hair and pale skin. She was wearing a white dress that was stained with blood. Her eyes were empty, and she was staring straight at me. I froze in fear, not knowing what to do. The girl started to walk towards me, her hands outstretched as if she wanted to touch me. I stepped back, but I couldn't move any further. I was trapped, and the ghost was getting closer. Suddenly, the girl stopped in her tracks and looked up at the sky. I followed her gaze and saw that the moon was shining bright, casting an eerie light over everything. The ghost started to scream, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the night. I knew that I had to do something. I closed my eyes and started to pray. I begged for forgiveness for any wrong I had ever done, and I asked for protection from the ghost. When I opened my eyes again, the ghost was gone. The truck started without any trouble, and I drove away as fast as I could. I never looked back, but I knew that I had experienced something that I would never forget. That night, I learned that ghosts were real, and they could be terrifying. I made a promise to myself to never drive that road again, but the memory of that night still haunts me to this day. From that day on, I avoided driving through that part of the country at all costs, afraid that I might encounter that woman again, and that next time, I might not be so lucky. I was driving down the long and lonely highway, making my way back home after a long haul. It was late at night, and I was tired, but I knew I had to keep going. Suddenly, my truck started to sputter and then died completely, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I got out of the truck and looked around. There was nothing but darkness and silence as far as I could see. I tried starting the engine again, but it wouldn't budge. I knew I had to find some help, but I was in the middle of nowhere, and there were no signs of life around me. As I was walking down the road, hoping to find some help, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around and saw a ghostly figure standing behind me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I was frozen in fear as it slowly floated towards me. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The ghost was getting closer and closer, and I could feel its icy breath on my neck. I knew I was done for. Suddenly, I heard a voice calling out my name. It was my friend Jack, who was also a truck driver. He had been driving down the same road and had seen my truck on the side of the road. He had stopped to help me. As soon as Jack appeared, the ghostly figure disappeared into thin air. Jack helped me fix my truck and get it started again. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I knew I had encountered a ghost on that dark and lonely road, and it had almost taken me down. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper behind me. I froze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, as if it was trying to escape. The whisper grew louder and more distinct, until it sounded like a woman's voice. "Please help me," the voice said. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The wind was howling through the trees, and I could feel goosebumps on my arms. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, I heard the voice again. "Please help me," it said. This time, I could tell that it was coming from outside. I hesitated for a moment, but then I opened the door and stepped outside. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. That's when I saw her. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned dress. She was standing in the distance, under the dim light of a street lamp. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was almost translucent. I could feel my body trembling as I stared at her. "Please help me," she said again. I took a step towards her, and then another. As I got closer, I could see that she was floating above the ground. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was as if I had stepped into a nightmare. The woman floated towards me until she was only a few feet away. I could feel a chill in the air, and my breath was visible in front of me. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. The woman didn't reply. Instead, she reached out and touched my forehead with her cold, bony fingers. I felt a surge of energy flow through me, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my truck. The engine was running, and I was driving down the road. At first, I thought it had all been a dream. But then, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the woman sitting in the back seat. I screamed and swerved off the road, crashing into a ditch. I blacked out again. When I woke up, it was morning. My truck was wrecked, and I had a splitting headache. I stumbled out of the truck, and that's when I saw her again. The woman was standing in the distance, watching me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The woman floated towards me until she was standing right in front of me. "Please help me," she said one last time before disappearing into thin air. I never drove through that road again. To this day, I can still hear her voice in my nightmares. As we were driving away, I looked back, and the ghost was still standing there, staring at us. I knew that it was going to haunt me forever. From that day on, I made sure to avoid that stretch of road as much as possible. But every time I did have to drive through there, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, wondering if that ghostly figure was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to come after me once again. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. All I wanted was to get home, to my wife and kids, and collapse into my own bed. But fate had other plans for me. As I was driving down a dark, deserted road, I saw something move in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized that it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, not sure what to do. I could see that the figure was wearing a white dress and had long, dark hair. As I got closer, I realized that it was a woman standing with her back to me. She seemed to be crying. I didn't know what to do. Should I stop and offer her a ride? Or should I just drive on by? But before I could make a decision, the woman turned around. Her face was a ghastly white, her eyes black as coal. She looked straight at me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. She had no expression on her face, but I could feel her staring at me, as if she was trying to tell me something. I didn't know what to do. I tried to drive around her, but she stepped in front of my truck, blocking my path. I hit the brakes, but it was too late. The truck skidded to a halt, and I felt a jolt as the woman's body slammed into the windshield. I sat there for a moment, dazed and confused. What had just happened? Had I hit a real person, or was it just my imagination? But as I got out of the truck, I realized that it was real. The woman was lying on the ground, her body twisted and broken. Her eyes were open, staring up at me, and I could see the terror in them. I knew I had to do something. I called 911, and they dispatched an ambulance and the police. But as I waited, I felt a sense of unease. I could feel the woman's presence around me, as if she was still there, watching me. As the ambulance arrived, I could hear the paramedics talking about how there was no pulse, how the woman was already dead when I hit her. But I knew that wasn't true. I had seen her alive, standing in the middle of the road. I drove home in a daze, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. As I pulled into my driveway, I could see the woman's face in my mind, haunting me with her ghostly gaze. I was still shaking with fear, and I knew that I would never forget this experience. When I finally made it home, I tried to convince myself that what had happened was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew that it was real. I had encountered a ghost on that dark and lonely road, and it had terrified me to my core. From that day on, I never drove down that road again. But the memory of that night, and the ghostly woman who had haunted me, stayed with me forever. I made sure to avoid that stretch of road as much as possible. But every time I did have to drive through there, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, wondering if that ghostly figure was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to come after me once again.
I have 3 road trip stories. Here goes the first one. Number 1, breakdown. It's actually been really hard getting around to telling this story. My story took place about 10 years ago. My friend Jake and I grew up together. We were best friends for as long as I can remember. We always sat by each other at school, We hung out during recess. We played video games together. We were very, very close. We even decided to go to the same college together. I thought Jake could have gotten into a much better school than me, but like me, he wanted us to have the experience together. When the time came for us to leave for college, we left a few days before we had to be there and made it into a road trip. We gave ourselves 3 days worth of driving to get there. Now, neither Jake nor me had ever driven that long of a distance before, so it was quite an adventure. We thought it would be cool to see some of the countryside before having to buckle down and study. The second day, we were driving through the mountains. It was a new experience too because I'd never done it. I think I felt sick a lot of the time and it likely had to do with the elevation. However, towards the end of the day, something went wrong with the car. I was driving and it suddenly seized up. I had trouble even getting it off the road. Jake and I couldn't really figure out what to do with the car. It was beyond our expertise. We were also in a bad area as far as cell phone signals were concerned. We didn't know how far away we were from a gas station either. So we decided that one of us would hitchhike to a gas station and get some help. All of our belongings were in the car and in the trailer to the car, so one of us had to stick with the car. Jake decided that he would be the one to go and find help. It took a while before a car picked him up. By that point, there wasn't much sunlight left. So I just sat in the driver's seat and waited. The sun went down. A state trooper at one point pulled up to the car and I had a chat with him. I let him know what was going on and that my friend had hitched a ride to try and get help. He took some information and said he would drive to the gas station to see if my friend had gotten there. Apparently, about 30 miles away there was a gas station with a garage and they could have towed our car for us. The officer asked how long I had been waiting, and I let him know at that point that it had been over 3 hours. This would be time enough for the car with my friend to go to the gas station, get the tow truck and be back 3 times over. When the officer left, I was concerned. When the officer was gone a long time, I was more concerned. It was dark out and for the first time I truly felt alone. It was an odd, unpleasant feeling. But I also sort of felt that I didn't want the officer to come back because I somehow knew it would be bad news. It was nearly 2 hours later that the officer came back. He had the 2 trucks with him and I was relieved. I was sure that Jake was with them. However, when the officer came to my car, Jake wasn't with him. He informed me that no one had stopped at the gas station to get a tow. He also checked to see if anyone had seen the car with Jake in it. No one was able to pull it up from memory. The car was towed. While it was being worked on, I had to go to the police station and file a report. They had to call Jake's parents and let them know he was missing. I got a motel room in the area. I put off the trip because I was worried about my friend. I spent 4 days in that motel, freaked out and worried I would never see my friend Jake again. Finally, the police came to talk to me. The car that Jake had gotten a ride in was found in a grocery store parking lot. Jake was in the trunk. He was naked, beaten, bloody and unconscious, but he was still alive. He was in a coma for about a month before he gained consciousness again. And even after that, it was weeks before he was able to recognize me or anyone, and even longer before he was able to recall what had happened. I don't want to go into too much detail, but the people that had picked him up had stolen the car they were driving. They robbed him of his money and credit cards and cell phone. It was actually due to the credit cards that they were eventually caught. There were 2 men and one of them is still in jail. I didn't go to college that year, but I am happy to tell you that the following autumn, Jake and I finally made it to college together. This time, however, we flew and his parents came with us. We spent all 4 years roomed together and are still best friends to this day. Hitchhiking for any reason is a really bad idea. If Jake and I had waited, the officer would have eventually come upon us and my friend would never have had this happen. Here goes the second story. Number 2, One Good Turn. One of the most profound moments of my life came on my way to college for the first time. I was only 18 years old and I was leaving home for the first time. I had been at the college grounds once before, but it was with my parents. I left on a drive across the country in an old car and by myself for the first time ever. I have to admit being both excited and terrified, more than I had ever been in my life up to that point. About 2/3 of the way through the trip, I was traveling through a mountainous region. I am not too comfortable explaining where it is, so I hope you'll forgive me for that. But going through the area, I ran into a bit of car trouble. I was far enough from any town or exit that I wasn't going to chance trying to walk, so I was worried about exactly what would happen. My cell phone didn't get any sort of signal, so I wasn't able to call for help. However, a small pickup truck pulled over and two guys, a bit older than me, got out and helped me. After about an hour of fiddling around with my car, they fixed my car. I call it fiddling because I honestly just don't understand what they were doing. I offered to pay them for it, but they refused to accept anything. They just asked me to pay it forward. I assured them I would, and honestly, I fully intended to. But making a promise when you're in the situation isn't really as easy as keeping it when you're not. A full 2 years of college went by and I could honestly say that I didn't do anything that once might consider repayment of the good deed. I, in fact, largely forgot about it. I was driving home for Thanksgiving in the fall of my junior year of college. This, of course, took me right back through the same mountainous area. Driving through a rather lonely stretch of road, I noticed something up in the distance on the right side of the road. A car had been pulled over and someone had the hood up, working on it. Immediately, everything from the experience I had 2 years earlier came flooding back. I remembered how grateful I was to the kindness of the two men who had helped me out. I also remembered my agreement to pay it forward. So, of course, realizing that it had been over 2 years and that I hadn't paid the favor back, I imagined how good I would feel about doing it. Still, with all the thought, I didn't decide right away. I was going downhill on the road, and the car was on the uphill side, right before I was to hit a tunnel. I probably changed my mind back and forth before ultimately deciding to stop and help, and the decision was made only seconds before I actually stopped the car. Rather than wait for me to get out of my car, the man immediately came from under the hood of the car and began walking towards my passenger door. I found this odd as I hadn't offered him a ride. I mean, I was going to, since I didn't have any ability to work on his car for him, but it was just strange that he would automatically assume this. However, I still remembered that I was trying to do a good deed here, so I unlocked the passenger side door. As the man approached the door and was about to lift the door handle, I noticed some movement from the back of the truck. It looked to me like a second person, crouched down, had moved from the back of the truck to the back of my car. I mean, I wasn't completely sure, but it was enough to make me react and quickly lock the passenger side door right before the first man pulled up on the handle. The first man hadn't expected to pull up on a locked handle, I guess, and he actually stumbled back a bit. I noticed that he had a gun in the waistband of his pants. The man behind my car had obviously expected the door to open. He had quickly moved over to the driver's side door, which I had locked just a moment before. He had a knife in his right hand. I saw the first man reach for his gun, but not before I hit the gas and took off past the two men and into the tunnel. I watched back as long as I could, and I did see them get into their car. I kept expecting them to follow me into the tunnel, to give chase to me. But they never came after me. All I can think of is that they were scared of being caught. Whatever the hell they were up to, turned and left in the other direction. I guess maybe I was a bit too literal in my promise. I was simply asked to repay a good deed by paying it forward. I thought that this meant that I had to help someone else whose car was broken down. This almost got me hurt and maybe killed. When I got back to school, I volunteered at a soup kitchen for the rest of the year. I was able to do a good deed which was, in fact, not life-threatening in any way. Here goes the third and the last story. Number 3, a wrong turn. This happened back when I was a teenager. My best friend turned 16 and his parents went and bought him a car. Well, once that happened, we were always out driving somewhere. I mean, if you had a car around when you were that age, you'd understand what I mean. Once you get a taste of that sort of freedom, it's like a drug and you take it all the time. So this happened on a weekend night. We had gone and grabbed a bite to eat. Neither of us really felt like going home. We lived in a suburban area and we weren't really supposed to drive too far away. We also were not supposed to drive on the freeway either. However, we were bored teenagers and we figured that there was no way that our parents would figure out what we had done, so we got on the freeway and thought we'd take it to the city. Our inexperience caused us to make a really big mistake. Though, we drove into the city on the interstate. We spent a little bit of time there, and on the way back, unbeknown to us at the time, we got on the wrong interstate. We kept expecting to get back to the area we lived in, but the further and further we drove, we came to the conclusion that we must have gotten on the wrong road. After discussing it a little bit, we decided to take the next exit and try to find a gas station or something to ask for directions back to the right area. So without thinking to look and see if there was a sign for a gas station at the next exit, we took the exit. There were no businesses right at the exit, but we didn't want to get back on the interstate, so we drove down the road, trying to find someplace. I can't tell you how long we were driving down that road. We came across a few houses here and there. There were some stores and small diners here and there as well, but it was late and they were all closed. Both of us started to panic, not really sure what we needed to do. We eventually decided the best thing to do would just be to turn around, drive back to the interstate, find an exit with a gas station, and hope that we made it without running out of gas. So we turned on the next road, which was a very thin road. We figured we would get to the first driveway and then turn around in that. I tried to tell my friend just to pull out of the road, but he didn't want to do that. So our situation, which was bad in the beginning and kept getting worse, had just gotten worse again. The road was dark then and didn't appear to have any driveways on it. We were both tense and scared. It was then that we saw something up ahead of us. There were two guys walking towards us on the side of the road. We thought this would be good and that we would be able to ask them if there was a place to turn around. However, they froze when they saw us and then, after a moment, ran off the road into the woods. We were confused, but thought there could be many reasons for this. We kept driving. We very soon saw an old pickup truck laying in a ditch on the side of the road. We drove by it, and when I saw it, I felt my chest tighten up a bit. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. However, the person was not moving and their head was lolled back. There looked to be blood on the door of the truck. We passed it and eventually came to a driveway. We used it to turn around and drive back. When the truck on the side of the road came into view, we noticed that the two men who had run into the woods were at the truck. They saw us once again, but this time they ran off a lot quicker. When we drove up to the truck, it was much more obvious this time that whoever was in the driver's seat was dead. This time the truck was on my friend's side of the car. When he noticed it, he just hit the gas and drove as quickly as he could. We got off the road, took the name of the road, and drove back to the interstate. The next exit had a gas station. We went there and asked the attendant to call the police. The police had to call our parents and we got chewed out big time for having driven so far away. And the man in the truck was indeed dead. And it wasn't in a car wreck. He was stabbed several times in the chest. And we had no doubt that the men who killed him were the two guys that twice ran away from us when they saw us coming. Even though the guys fled both times, it was still terrifying to think that they were so close to us on that thin, poorly lit road. We also wondered if they lived in the driveway we came across, but we don't know. All we do know is that a wrong turn can lead you somewhere you really never want to go. Many years ago, a friend and I decided to visit our mutual friend at her university and spend the weekend with her. We had extremely detailed directions to follow, and we were told the trip should take about 3 hours. While nothing went wrong on our drive, it seemed to take forever. I don't remember exactly at what point the woods started, but I do remember traveling through these woods for a long time, perhaps an hour. We were already well past the 3-hour time frame my friend had given us by the time we left the woods. When we finally reached my friend's college town, it was nearly 4.5 hours since we'd left. We didn't get lost. We never hit traffic or stopped for more than a few minutes. But we quickly forgot about it, since we were happy to spend the weekend with our friend. When the trip back was a little over 3 hours, we thought it was weird but didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until my next trip to visit that I realized something had been strange. I spent that whole next trip waiting for the long path through the woods that we had been on the first time, but they never appeared. Following the same directions as the first time, the entire trip took me about 3 hours, as did every other trip I made out there in the following years. I don't know what happened, and I've never been able to replicate it. I still wonder what happened and where we really were when passing through those woods. In short, a 3-hour trip turned into 4.5 hours, and the woods we drove through don't seem to exist. I had been on a day trip with a couple of friends and was returning home. This was about 11 to 12 o'clock at night. It was roughly a 2-hour drive on a main highway, and around 30 minutes from home my friend who was driving said, "I think that car is following us. Every time I change lanes, they change lanes. When I pass another car, they pass the car and get back behind us. They've been doing it for a long time now." We thought it was kind of odd, made sort of nervous jokes. Obviously a serial killer. They just like your driving. We passed through a couple of smaller towns, had to stop at red lights, and the car would be right behind us. Looked like just one person in the car. Still, we didn't become concerned, that is until we reached the road I live on, a small 2-lane road, and when we turned, this car turned behind us. Up until then we had figured it was just someone going the same way we are going, they're not really following us. Now though, it was getting a little freaky. It got really freaky when we pulled into my driveway and the car pulled in behind us. They didn't nose in, but crossways of the drive, like they were trying to block us in. We all sat there for a moment, saying, "What the fuck? Is this someone we know?" The car didn't look familiar to any of us. We could see the guy's silhouette and he was just sitting there staring straight ahead. Well, we were 3 young, pretty big guys, and I finally said, "Fuck this shit. I'm going to see what this dude's problem is." So we all 3 got out and walked to the car. I went around to the driver's side, and the guy was just sitting there staring straight ahead with the car still running. Some young white dude, looked like 20 or 30 years old. He wasn't anyone we knew. I tapped on the window, which I noticed was partially open, and asked the dude, "Do you need some help or something?" The guy looked at me with a sort of surprised look on his face, said "Oh," then threw his car in gear and hauled ass out of there. Don't have one clue what was up with that dude. It seemed to freak him out when he saw us. We figured maybe he was following someone else and got behind the wrong car. North Dakota, drove to Denver for the work tour. I woke up at about 6 a.m., spent the day in a hot asphalt parking lot, joined in the festivities, and for some ungodly reason we decided after the show to drive home that night. You can either go through the Black Hills or go straight up to Route 94 in Montana, then head east. I chose the latter. Fast forward to southeastern Montana at around 2 a.m. My only passenger had fallen asleep. I didn't have the GPS going on my phone because I got this. While Route 212 in Montana has a fork that you need to turn right onto Route 59 to start heading north to Route 94. I drive right past this. I make it something like 75 goddamn miles past this turn before I realize what had happened. Now it's about 3 or 3:30 a.m. I'm in a town so small that it only has one bar and no gas station. I pull out my phone and desperately search for alternate routes. Absolutely fucking nothing. I take dirt roads or I backtrack. I'm already in zero fucks given mode, so I start heading north out of town on a gravel road. My passenger is awake at this point, It's worth noting he doesn't have a driver's license, so no break for me. I'm chain smoking cigarettes and topping off Red Balls, having a grand old time driving through bumfuck nowhere Montana down a gravel road that has a decent amount of trees or shrubs on both sides. This road has the audacity to pull out a dead end sign from fucking nowhere. For real? We hit the spot where the road turned into a prairie trail and had to turn around. As we started heading back, we saw, I shit you not, what looked to be maybe 10 or 20 LEDs blinking through the trees that turned into what looked to be a couple hundred blinking. I had a World Rally Experimental at the time, and I dropped that mofo into second and rally crossed the fuck out of there. At this point I was seeing shit like deer running out that weren't there, but I backtracked every damn mile and didn't slow down or stop until we hit the North Dakota border at about 8 a.m. I still don't even have an idea of what we may have seen, but fuck that shit. I am a trucker and I have seen some unexplainable things in my 12-year-long career. Out of all the possible incidents that come to my mind, I have one specific memory etched in my memory. A few years ago, I was driving through a native land in New Mexico on Highway 491. Now note this, the Highway 491 used to be Route 666. Yes, the notorious Route 666. But they changed it a few years back. I'm not sure why that happened, but it might have had to do with the negative press it had garnered over the decades. Anyways, I'm on my regular route driving through that route. By the middle of the night, I'm in the middle of the desert. There were no lights or civilization for miles. Not that I was expecting to see them, but I was literally in the middle of nowhere. I was listening to loud music just so I would stay awake, when up in the sky, there's a huge orange flash. It is hard to explain how it looked, but the orange flash quickly inflated into a giant ball in the sky. From where I was looking at it, it looked far more bigger than the sun. It even had some fiery looking texture to it. You know, as if it was on fire. Suddenly, the orange ball of fire disappeared, and the entire desert sky, from one horizon to the other horizon, flashed a bright yellow color, lighting up literally everything around me, like it was daytime. There was so much light that for a moment, I forgot I was driving at midnight. But after that bright yellow flash, everything went back to normal. Now note that all of this happened within a few seconds, but it was definitely among the weirdest thing I've ever seen on the road. And no, I was not drunk or high on anything. I never drink while I'm driving. In fact, when I reached the destination, I spoke to my fellow drivers about it. They said that they had never experienced anything of that sort. One said that there is an urban legend of a floating orb of light that is seen in the desert. And if one gets too close to it, it devours them. But what I saw was far more different than a floating ball of light. I had seen a massive fireball in the sky. It could not have been a meteor or anything. One explanation that I heard was the closest to logic. The desert that I was driving through in New Mexico is rumored as a testing ground for nuclear bombs or atomic research, and I might have seen a nuclear weapons test. Now again, that is not a confirmed explanation, but it surely is the closest one to logic. So as a trucker, it is mostly the UFO and supernatural stuff that I have experienced or witnessed out on the interstate. Within the first few months of driving, if I remember correctly, was in Pennsylvania. In my first couple of years, I was a night driver, so sometimes it was hard to see things clearly. But the one incident that I remember in Pennsylvania was me trying to follow a flatbedder who was hauling serious shit through the mountains. At one point, I started to fall back on my seat because I could literally feel the van starting to lean a little. It wasn't long after that I reached down to take a swing off the handy monster I had, and I look up to see that there's a guy standing off to the shoulder of my truck, just outside the tree line. He was wearing what appeared to be some type of a soldier's uniform. It looked like from a Revolutionary War era. He had a musket too. As I approached him, I could see him staring right at me, and then he started walking back into the tree line, still looking at me. It was creepy. That look was chilling. And before he managed to make it through the trees, he disappeared. like he literally vanished into thin air, that too in front of my eyes. I had my windows down, and the air had gotten really cold. That too suddenly. I continued driving, and then after about a mile, the air warmed up again. I had a really sad feeling come over me for a while afterward. Needless to say, I didn't stop for the rest of my trip. Okay, so I'll list some states. Firstly, New Mexico, then Nevada and Utah. These are some of the states that to this day, I still see random stuff in the skies that I simply cannot explain. Sometimes lights rapidly change directions and take off at blinding speeds, but no sound barrier being broken. As a trucker, I have also seen some lights hovering over the desert, several miles off the interstate. Then it suddenly takes off and the lights are cut out. Not only that, but there are various shapes and sizes of it from what I can make out while I drive at night. Yes, the visibility is low, but that helps me see those shape of lights distinctly. Just so you know, I know the military aircrafts pretty well, and some of the lights were more than likely those aircrafts. But some of them absolutely cannot be any military aircraft that is currently in mainstream use. Conventional aircraft do not move like that. The most vivid one would be at an off-ramp in New Mexico. One day I was driving for hours, and so I stopped to take a piss, and decided to turn it into a 15-minute break, since my butt was sore anyway. As I was stargazing and admiring how clear the sky is, I saw what looked somewhat like a formation of lights in the shape of a triangle lift off from the desert floor, and then take off into the sky. I kept my eyes on it, and it just kept gaining altitude until the lights just disappeared. I looked down at my watch, and noticed that it was not ticking, so I pulled out my phone and it was off too. I turned my phone on, and according to the time on my phone, it had been 5 minutes since my watch had stopped. I am not sure how, but I felt like whatever it was that just took off had something to do with it. But to this day, I have not been able to figure out as to what exactly it was. Now this one might not be a scary story as such, but it was scary for me. I was driving across Kent, Texas. There's an old Chevron station over there, and it seems like FedEx drivers like stopping in there in droves. Well, my guess is that it's a popular drop and hook point for them or something. I never really stopped there since I never cared, and moreover, I had my own designated stops. But one fine day, I stopped there, as I needed to take a piss. I don't know why I didn't stop in Van Horn, which was barely a few miles before, but whatever. So I pull off, and I roll up to the empty lot across the street. Now, just so you know, Kent is an abandoned town. I walk up to the bush line, and notice a makeshift fire pit. The wood is somewhat burned, but not all the way. The weird thing is that there's an unscathed dollar bill stuck in the wood. For a second I was like, oh, piece of candy, but then this sudden feeling of nope came over me. So I left it alone and pissed in the bush. As I'm walking back, I look over at it and get a real negative feeling. It was instinctive. I look to the ground in front of me and bam, there's a rattlesnake looking right at me. I stop dead in my tracks and walk carefully around it, and it keeps staring at me. I ran as fast as I could back to my truck, feeling like somebody was behind me. I kicked up a lot of dust getting out of there and have never stopped in Kent since. I remember one occasion when I was driving in Arizona. It was a shocking moment for me. A lady was begging for money, which isn't uncommon at truck stops. One usually expects beggars to approach for money. So the lady approached me. She gave me the whole sob story of her boyfriend who left her. She didn't have a job, lost the apartment. Her 2 kids were hungry, and she didn't know what to do. Me being a social creature, I let the conversation go on for some reason. To make it short, she was molested by her father as a child, forced on several occasions in her teen years, and then found a lesser of an evil boyfriend who tried to get her into drugs, got her pregnant, and beat her all the time. Now I have heard that kind of story from beggars all the time, but just in case she was telling the truth, I gave her what I had in my pockets. It ended up being roughly over $60. She broke down and cried right there, then I started to wonder that maybe she was telling the truth. She walked away after some more small talk. I go inside to get dinner, and bigger than shit, I see her with 2 kids that look as sad as they could ever be, getting dinner. They all looked depressed. I knew then that she wasn't lying about anything she told me, and I felt a lot of remorse for not doing more. So I told the waitress to put their meal on my tab. The look on her face when the waitress said that their meal was being paid by somebody else was a look I'll never forget. And that does not mean I'll trust every beggar. Around 2006-ish, I was driving flatbed, picked up a load of construction material, drywall, roofing. Don't remember, but it was pre-packaged in boxes. And I remember having to use strap protectors on the load. In rural Tennessee, the memory is foggy now, but I want to say it was between Memphis and Nashville, but closer to the intersection of the MS-LTN state lines. Tarp required, so I strapped everything down, parked the load, and left the shipper. About 5 miles down the road, in the middle of nowhere woods on a 2-lane road, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind. I found a wide shoulder and pulled over to fix it. I realized that I just flat did a shitty job tarping this load and decide to redo it on the side of the road. I undo all the bungee straps, drag the tarps off, roll them back up, climb up on the load and start unrolling the tarps again, and I see a guy walking down the same side of the road I'm on, coming towards my truck. I don't think anything about it other than to keep an eye on him cause I'm in the middle of nowhere, and continue what I'm doing. About the time I have tarps set in place, and I am climbing down to start hooking the bungee straps back on, this dude is getting close enough that I'm now paying more attention to him than I am to tarping my load. I grab my winch bar and set it on the trailer where I'm working just in case. It's an 8-pound solid metal bar about 4 feet long, tapered to a blunt point on one end and hollow on the other, used for tightening straps and chains, etc. The guy gets to me and the first thing I notice is his hair. It's like a mullet, but it's patchy as fuck. Like he tried to cut his own hair, had a seizure in the process, and said fuck it, good enough to party. The next thing I noticed were his eyes, which I can only describe as off. Like they were clear. I didn't think he was drunk or high or anything, but it also gave me the distinct impression that the elevator didn't go all the way up. Clothes were dirty and not well maintained, with dirty white tennis shoes, cause I remember he didn't have laces on one shoe, and the tongue was noticeably out of place. He stops by me, waits until I acknowledge him, and just says I've got a long walk. I'm like, yeah man, you do, we're in the middle of nowhere. Making it clear there's no ride to be had here. He nods, starts walking by me, continuing on his way, stops at about the driver door on my truck and turns around, comes back to me and repeats himself. I've got a long walk. At this point I explain that I can't give him a ride, insurance and all that. Apologize for not being able to help him out, and he seems to accept this, turns around and leaves. I wait for him to get a little ways away from my truck and start working on finishing the tarp job. I still keep an eye on him and he's moving away from me. As I'm putting on the last of the bungee straps, I look over to check where he's at, and he's turned around heading back towards me, now about 100 yards in front of my truck and coming back my way. It looks like he's talking on a cell phone, has his hand up to his face, and I can barely make out his mouth moving, his other hand waving like he's having a conversation with someone. I finish with the straps, grab my winch bar, and am climbing into my truck as he's about 10 yards away now. Soon as I'm in the cab, I lock the doors and set the winch bar on the passenger seat just in case. I look at the guy and realize he's not talking on a phone. He's talking to his fucking hand, and now I'm nervous, cause he doesn't look like he's having a nice pleasant chat. It looks more like an angry conversation. I cranked the truck up, put it in gear, and just pulled out. Didn't look for traffic or anything. As I pass him, he's just looking at me, still holding his hand to his face with this dead-ass look on his face, just staring at me. Gave me the creeps. About the time I hit 5th or 6th gear, I look in the mirror and there's no one there. He vanished into thin air. Now that I think about the incident, I just hope that I had encountered a crazy human and not something paranormal. Comment what you think about this story, and until then I'll begin reading the next one. Okay, I got one while I was actually driving a bus which was made out of a truck in the deserts of Central Australia. I was over 500 kilometers from the nearest town. So yeah, middle of nowhere stuff. So I was out on a 5-day charter to pick up a bunch of Aboriginal elder women to go and get their women's business health checks done, pap smears and mammograms, etc. I believe. On the day I took them to get that done, we went via a place called Mintavi so they could shop in the clothing and whatever store that's randomly in this little opal mining area of South Australia. We left from there quite late to make the 3 or so hour journey back to where we were all staying overnight. The next day I'd take them back to their respective desert communities. The passengers all fell asleep as they'd had a very long day, as had I, but that's my job. Even the nurse who was traveling with us fell asleep. So there's me all alone in the cab of the Mercedes truck-derived bus, my 30 passengers all sleeping in the darkness of the passenger pod behind the cab, and it was around 9 p.m. Up ahead in the distance I see a headlight coming towards me along the lonely desert dirt road, so I dim my lights so the spotlights go off, and adjust to see only what low beam will show me. I drive down into a slight dip of a dry creek bed, expecting to see the car with only one headlight anytime shortly. It's nothing unusual to see a car with only one headlight out there, so I'm not even remotely bothered. As I come out of the dip, I put my spotlights and high beams back on, and there is no car, no nothing, just the empty dirt road. There is no dust in the air and I can see a good distance in front of me and out to each side. There was nothing there, just the empty desert, the dirt road and me alone in the cab. I keep the lights all on until we come to a stop about an hour later. I didn't see any cars or anything the rest of the journey. Before I let the passengers out, I ask if any of them saw the light, and they all go dead silent. And after a short while they start talking in their own language, which were Pityantyatjara and Yankunityatyara, hurriedly, and then they all get off the bus. A few minutes later, a couple of the ladies come up to me to ask me to tell them exactly what I saw, without leaving anything out, and to describe exactly where I saw it. Now I'm a big guy. I've lived on 3 continents. I've been a police officer, a teacher, bus and coach driver, truck driver, all sorts of things. Let's just say that I'm pretty skeptical, but I do have an open mind. I'm not scared by much in this world. After I told these ladies everything from start to finish, and described in minute detail exactly where it happened, I took note of exactly how far out we were when it happened. The 2 ladies looked at me with the whites showing in their eyes. They looked spooked, and they said, and I'll never forget the way they said it, I got on great with the indigenous people of Central Australia and trust that I know when something rattles them. They said, this driver, we're so lucky that you did not stop, because if you did, no one would have seen any of us ever again. We'd all be gone. I asked why, and they just shook their heads and said to not talk about it because it had scared all the ladies. I'm sure many people have heard about the Min Min lights in Western Queensland. Well, whatever these ladies knew about whatever I saw in our location, they were convinced that it wasn't something you wanted to meet in the desert at night. I only ever saw this once. I only saw it for maybe a minute, and it just looked like a car headlight a couple of kilometers away up the road. But I'll tell you what, if the ladies that come from this area, and whose people have survived in this desolate, remote part of the continent for 60,000 years are worried to the point of all being scared, I certainly don't want to mess with whatever it is. Have you ever read about such abnormal lights? How would you react if you came across one while you were in the middle of a desert? Comment down below until I begin reading the next one. I used to deliver hotshot freight across the Great Plains around the Minnesota area. One night around 2 a.m. I was hauling across North Dakota, trying to reach Montana by morning. I was delivering a particularly valuable tractor part that a farm desperately needed for the following day. I began to notice some highway hypnosis sneaking up on me, but it didn't really bother me because I'd been through it hundreds of times before. Anyone who has driven across North Dakota knows that it is incredibly flat, like really flat. There also tends to be very straight and long roads. It's somewhat easy to see things on the road that are far away, even at night. I noticed something long on the road, spanning my entire lane, approximately half a mile in front of me. I slowed down a little and prepared to move into the opposite lane, thinking it was some retread off a blown tire. As I got closer, I noticed it was two people laying head to toe across the entire lane. I swerved into the other lane, successfully avoiding them, and came to an almost complete stop. But they didn't move, not an inch. I was just about to back up and check on them when I remembered a story that an old graybeard colleague of mine had told me. He told me that in certain remote areas, people will lie down in the middle of the road and wait for a car or truck to stop and see what's going on. At that point, the road layers, along with whoever else is hiding in the nearby bushes, will beat the shit out of the driver and steal his vehicle, leaving him in the middle of nowhere. I decided not to back up, and when the two people in the road saw me put my truck back in gear and drive away, they both got up and walked toward the shoulder. I called the police and explained what happened, but we were so far away from civilization that I doubt anything came of it. Thanks to that old graybeard, I got to keep my truck, my job, and my teeth. Not a truck driver, but once was driving through the Canadian Rockies late at night and had just passed through a small town. So I'm driving through the pitch black and I need to stop to pee and have a smoke, but because it's so dark, miss the last rest stop for the next while. No problem, the highway is completely deserted, so I pull to the side of the road, have my pee while staring out into the dark, and then light up a cigarette and stand by my car. As I'm standing there, I see the figure of a man just walking out of the tree line. I'm miles from civilization, patchy cell service, and there isn't a soul on the road. Thought my eyes were playing tricks on me and maybe it was a deer, but nope, this was a man. So calmly walk back to the driver's door and get in, locking the doors behind me. I'm keeping my eye on this guy as I nervously smoke and have my car in drive, ready to peel out, but for some reason just stayed put. The Quee walks right up to my passenger door and knocks on the window. I crack the window and ask what's up. He replies to me in a very, very serious tone. I need you to call the cops. I cautiously ask why, and he tells me he had gone out into the woods to kill himself, but he couldn't go through with it because he had thought of his daughters right before he was about to do it. I call the cops while the guy quietly cries outside. He had a kitchen knife that he was going to use on himself, so I stayed in the car and advised him to maybe leave the knife on the ground before the cops arrived. The cops came and got him, but before they left with him, I gave him a solid heart-to-heart and wished him well. I still think about him, and I hope he was able to turn things around. This happened back in the 80s when I was maybe 8, and my brother was around too. We were taking a road trip with my mom to visit my aunt and uncle, who lived in a small town that was hours away in the mountains. We didn't drive the most reliable car and got a late start on the 5-hour trip. Sure enough, our car broke down about halfway there, as it often did. We were stranded on the side of a highway with dark quickly approaching, just a woman and 2 young kids. This was before the time of cell phones and there was no exit in sight. After some time, a real charmer, a state trooper, came by and said he couldn't offer us much help, but he'd call us a tow truck, then drove off. My mom was furious at the time that a state trooper would leave a mother and 2 young kids stranded on the side of a highway in the middle of nowhere, but couldn't do much about it as he insisted that he couldn't stay with us. Well, we waited and waited and the tow truck didn't come. Finally, someone stopped, but it wasn't a tow truck. It was a huge 18-wheeler shipping truck. Out jumped a scraggly long-haul truck driver, complete with a trucker hat and long beard. He asked what the problem was and quickly offered us a ride to the next motel. My mom thanked him but says she'd really prefer him to call us a tow truck with his CB radio. Conveniently enough, the truck driver said his radio was broken so he couldn't make the call, but he'd be more than happy to drive us to the next motel. My mom thought and debated as the darkness was enclosing upon us, and as she debated, a pit formed in my 8-year-old stomach. Every hair was standing in my body, and I grabbed my mom's arm. Holding back tears, Whisper shouted into her ear, "No." She didn't immediately listen because it was getting scary around us, and so far he was the only one who had actually stopped, aside from the unhelpful cop. I didn't know why, but just knew we would never be seen again if we got into that man's truck. My mom continued to consider her options, and by now I had tears running down my face, although I was afraid for the trucker to see. I quietly pleaded with my mom, "No, please no, we can't go with him," until she finally told him thanks but no thanks, still not knowing what our fate would be on the side of a pitch-black highway miles from civilization. The trucker tried a few more times to persuade my mom, but probably realized that it was going to be a problem. He finally drove off, and almost instantly, a tow truck showed up and brought us to a rest stop for the night. I have never been as scared as I was that night, and my mom still tells the story of how I probably saved all of our lives at 8 years old. My uncle was a truck driver for many years. He doesn't share a lot of stories, but he told me this one night while we were drinking beer. He spent several years doing cross-country trips, often loading up his trailer in the middle of the night. While he waited for his trailer to be loaded, he'd make his way over to a nearby truck stop, have a late-night meal, and shoot the shit with any other drivers there. After a while, he would make friends with drivers that were on a somewhat similar schedule. He befriended this particular guy that he would run into about once a month or so. He said this guy was massive, a huge guy. My uncle is kind of a wise ass that can get annoying really quick. He said this was the one guy. He knew that when he crossed the line and agitated him, it was time to go. Anyway, he runs into this guy every so often, and they shoot the shit and kill time while their semi-trucks are getting loaded up. One night the guy invites him back to his semi. He wants to show him something he's built in his semi. This guy's semi has a sleeper on the back, so it's pretty big. Basically, it's a semi-truck with a small room right behind the driver to sleep in. My uncle is intrigued by seeing what kind of custom work this guy has done in his semi, so he goes along with him. Once they're in the truck, the guy shows him what he's built in the sleeper of his semi. It's a big, heavy-duty box. Apparently it has hydraulic arms on either side, so he can open and close it with the push of a button. He says once he pushes the button, it seals shut, can't be opened. My uncle is kind of weirded out by this and cracks a few jokes about the box. The guy starts to get a little agitated. My uncle realizes this and decides it's time to leave this guy's semi. A few months later, he finds out that the guy was a serial killer, stuffing truck stop hookers and others into this custom hydraulic box. At this point in the story, his hand starts shaking and he can barely drink his beer. That guy was massive, he says. His hand could cover most of my head. He could have stuffed me in the box, and there's nothing I could have done to stop him. Or shit, maybe there was someone in there already. He says he still has nightmares about it years later. About 17 years ago, my dad was a bait fish hauler who made runs from Arkansas to the Northeast and Midwest. At one point while he was in Ohio, traffic came to a dead halt accident right up ahead of him. A car had been barreling down the highway and drove right under a truck and hit the dot bar. Dad noticed the smoke, figured it meant a fire was starting up, so he jumped out and ran up to the back of the truck where a bunch of other truckers and some drivers were. An engine fire was indeed starting, and there were 2 kids in the back seat of the car, real disoriented from the impact. The back passenger window was too small in the car for them to smash open to get the kids out, so they had to go through the front passenger window. Dad was the only one with a small enough frame of the group willing to climb in, so he did. Unfortunately, the driver was too stupid and hadn't been wearing a seatbelt, so he'd been decapitated and his body was laying over on the passenger seat. So my dad had to climb over him between the front seats and pull two kids who were basically dead weight out. He managed to do so, and the car was mostly engulfed in flames about 15 minutes later. They handed the kids off to an elderly couple who took them back to their car and cleaned the blood off them and gave them some sandwiches they'd packed. State troopers got there a while later, took statements and all that from everyone. The state boys went back and checked on the kids. They were mostly fine, just a little shook. The oldest one was a little girl, and Dad had to chuckle at one point when the little girl said Mama's gonna be mad at Daddy this time. Made him wonder what other boneheaded moves the dude had done in the past. I remember when Dad came home after that run, he had a styrofoam ice chest with him that had his clothes in ice water. Those clothes had just been absolutely drenched in blood. Luckily, all came out in the wash, which was good with him because it was his favorite jeans covered in blood. I am not a trucker, but a dispatcher. We had a driver who had, shall we say, an odor problem. I'm not talking like body odor like sweat. I'm talking like stale urine. Any time he'd come into the dispatch office, it was a race to get him to leave again. The kind of putrid tang that would make you gag immediately and completely involuntarily, regardless of your best efforts. The driver was a rather heavy-set guy. Nice enough, but a little slow. We let it go until we started getting complaints from customers about the smell. Now, this driver was a flatbed driver, meaning most of his deliveries were onto construction sites, job sites, steel and lumber mills, etc. 90% of deliveries were outdoors, and in the company of rough and tough dudes who otherwise wouldn't give a damn what you smelled like. We'd get a couple phone calls a week from a job foreman saying that they wouldn't take this guy onto their site anymore because even outdoors, the smell was too bad for the workers. We started delicately attempting to bring it up, try to urge proper hygiene, etc. He claimed he showered every day or every other day at worst, and that's just what he smelled like, and has had the problem for as long as he could remember. Nothing he could do. At some point he had to bring his truck in for maintenance. It was a company truck, he didn't own it, but we don't rotate trucks, so he had the same one for months. Something had to be checked into at the gear shift, so the mechanic had to get inside the truck. Upon climbing into the cab, the mechanic promptly did a 180 and puked out the driver's side door. It was then that the big piss bucket was discovered. I'm not talking like a Gatorade bottle or something that he took a leak in so he didn't have to stop one time. I'm talking like a job site shop bucket filled nearly to the top with urine. The floor was wet around it, indicating it had splashed out. The inside of the cab, I'm told, because it was too chicken shit to get near this thing, smelled like him multiplied by 10. It was basically pure concentrated evil. Plus the walls of the cab had a slight yellow or brown dull sheen. We fired the driver using the complaints from customers as an excuse, and then parked the truck outside in our yard, doors and windows open for a week just to dull it. Then had a guy with a ghetto piece together hazmat type suit, rubber gloves, rubber boots, mask, rain slicker, etc. go in and basically douse the whole thing in bleach and cleaners. No matter what they did, they couldn't get rid of the smell. That truck sat outside in our yard for a full year, windows and doors standing wide open. Rain, snow, blustery wind. It just sat wide open to the elements. One day a year later, the boss decided to close it up and see how it was. Just as bad as the day they tried to clean it. He scrapped the truck a week later. As a man that has reached the ripe old age of 48, I can promise you I have seen some shit go down. This one totally takes the cake for me though. I was waiting out front of a truck stop back in the mid-80s. Sitting on a park bench with a guy that had a big Rottweiler kind of dog on a leash with him. I tried to make small talk, but he was quite a sourpuss. So we sat in silence for a few minutes until the most unexpected thing we had ever seen happened right before my very eyes. While we were sitting there, a big 18-wheeler pulls in without a trailer, bobtail, so he parks right up front like a normal car would. Inside the cab of the truck with the driver is a little monkey. The dance for the organ grinder kind. I think they are called rhesus monkeys perhaps. Well, the dog spots this little monkey and proceeds to go ape shit over it, lunging at the end of his leash and barking at the top of his lungs, generally making a real spectacle of himself to say the least. The driver is obviously upset, but not nearly as much as the monkey is. Actually, upset may be the wrong adjective to use for the monkey though. In retrospect, I think eagerly aggressive may be a more appropriate description for his disposition. He was pacing the dashboard back and forth, never taking his eyes off of this very aggravating dog. The driver opens his little triangle window that they don't make on cars anymore, the ones made for smokers back in the day. He yells out to this douchebag to call his dog off because it is upsetting his monkey. The guy laughs and says, "No way. I told you he was a jerk, didn't I?" He says that his dog ain't bothering nobody. The dog hasn't shut up since he laid eyes on the monkey. Promise you he is bothering everybody for several blocks around. Now here's where things start to get interesting. The driver says that if he doesn't call his dog off, he's gonna let his monkey loose on that dog. Douchebag laughs and says that his dog would eat that monkey alive. Upon hearing this, the driver leans over and reaches into his glove box. Guess. He pulls out one of those tiny baseball bats like you use to get at Astro World or carnivals and places it in the monkey's hand. The monkey obviously knows what's about to go down because he is now trying to squeeze out of that little triangular window mentioned earlier. This monkey has murder in his eyes if I've ever seen it. Driver hollers, "Last chance to save your dog's ass, man." In response, douchebag lets his dog off of the leash. Now we have a situation that has escalated to the point where we have a dog jumping up at the window and a monkey screaming profanities right back at him. Well, the driver finally rolls down the regular window and out leaps all kinds of miniature primate hell. The dog never knew what hit him. Quick as a flash, this monkey is riding on the back of this dog's neck. His two back feet all wrapped up in his neck fur with one hand hanging onto an ear. The other hand, as you may have guessed by now, is steadily and mercilessly raining down blows about this dog's head and face. I mean hard blows. You can hear them whop whop whop. Well, it only took a moment for the dog to realize he was in way over his head. He bolts yelping bloody murder as he runs away at full speed. I mean, this dog is running so fucking hard he's throwing up tufts of grass and dirt as soon as he leaves pavement. The monkey was still riding him and beating on him the whole time. Douchebag acts like he wants to fight now, but several people, including myself, stepped in to stop that nonsense. In a couple of minutes or so, the little monkey comes loping back with his little bat still in hand, and leaps up into the still open window of the truck to await his master, who has gone on into the store. That wanker ran off to try to go find his dog, but I don't know if he ever did. My ride showed up and had to go. Never again in this lifetime will see something so totally crazy and unexpected like that. I am both fortunate and humbled to have been so privileged to be present for such an event.